This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear in the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third-party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody. It's 9:30, so time to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells Borough Local Plan. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. Yeah, jolly good. Thank you very much. Well, welcome back for those of you who have attended previous sessions, and for those of you who haven't attended any of the hearing sessions so far, welcome along. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. I'll very quickly go through some sort of housekeeping and procedural matters with regard to today's hearing session, but before I do so, I'll just introduce the Programme Officer, Charlotte Glancy, who's on the call today. So I'll just ask Charlotte if she could just turn her camera and microphone on and just check that everybody has managed to log in okay.
Yes, I think we've got everybody in the room this morning. There's just one person in the room that's labelled as "I'll be with you soon," which I've gone on camera and asked, but nobody's responded. I think I might know who it is, so I'm just going to get to the bottom of that. Okay,
jolly good, thank you. Okay, well, we can make a start while Charlotte sorts out the various technical issues. So I'll just very quickly go through. I know that several of you have attended previous sessions. I think we're on to week 4 of the examination now, so I appreciate that several of you have heard this before, but there may be others that haven't, and there's some sort of new names around the virtual table today. So I'll very quickly just go through sort of the process of firstly the examination and the use of the Zoom platform for these hearings. So the hearings allow an opportunity for participants to put their points forward. So obviously this morning we're going to be talking about some of the key employment issues in the local plan and economic development. There's no agenda for today's session, so as per other sessions we'll go through the matters, issues and questions, and we may take some questions together and we may skip over some depending on people's representations and inputs, and we may spend longer on some of the other questions. What I would just say is obviously the hearings allow an opportunity for people to put their points forward. So whilst we go through the matters, issues and questions, certainly in relation to the sites, if anybody has representations about sites or policies and they think, well, hang on a minute, the inspector's not asked a question about that and we've made representations, then please do let me know. This is an opportunity to for people to put their points forward. What I would just say is more than happy for people to participate in the discussion. So generally I'll ask questions of the council to start with and then open up the discussion more widely. More than happy for people to participate, and I actively encourage that. But please do stick to your representations and please do stick to the points that you've raised in your representations. So obviously if you haven't made any representations about a particular site, then please do stick to the points that you've made. Hearings aren't an opportunity to introduce any new representations that you've not thus made. For those of you who do want to participate, how it works on the Zoom platform is at the bottom of the screen, there's various different buttons. So there's a list of participants, the chat and share screen functions, which have been disabled for today's meeting. And then I've got a button with interactions. If I go down to the bottom, I can raise hand like that, and then lower my hand as well. So if you do want to speak at any stage, use the raise hand function. So keep your camera and your microphone off with the exception of the council, and myself. So if you do want to speak, use the raise hand function. I can see that you want to participate in the conversation. I'll then bring you in. If it's the first time that you've spoken today, please can you introduce yourself? Let me know who you are. If you're acting on behalf of a particular client or landowner or parish council or developer, that'd be much appreciated. And again, there's quite a lot to get through today, but I think we'll get through it. And again, I'm mindful that people are sort of staring at screens for long periods, so we will take breaks. We'll take sort of comfort breaks as we go through the morning. And this morning's session's due to finish around 1 o'clock. And then it's a separate session for this afternoon. So for people who are attending this afternoon session, it's a separate session. So you should have a separate link from Charlotte, the Programme Officer. If you don't, please let Charlotte know and she can send that to you. So as we go through today, as we break or adjourn for sort of tea and coffee breaks, don't leave the meeting, just turn your cameras off and your microphones onto mute. But then once we come back after lunch, for those of you returning this afternoon, it is a separate session with a separate login. Anything from the council then before we get going?
No, thank you, sir.
No, thank you very much. Okay, so as I said, we'll go through matters, issues and questions. And we're starting with issue 1, which is key employment areas. So this is the main policy here is policy ED1. So as a starting point then, as an introduction to this topic, it's really worthwhile explaining for myself and those present at the hearing what the key employment areas are and how they've been defined. So how have you come to the conclusion that the various areas should be defined and allocated then as key employment areas?
Yeah, good morning. I'm Sharon Evans on behalf of Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. So I turn you to the Council's hearing statement on this matter, issue 1, key employment areas, which sets out clearly the background to the key employment areas. And they're essentially long established existing areas of employment and economic activity within the borough. They're well located, sustainable locations and accessible. And the information is set out in the local plan, which supports policy ED1, which is the key employment areas. And there's further evidence set out within the economic needs study, which has informed the local plan. These areas have been previously identified within the previous core strategy 2010, and they were reassessed as part of the economic needs study. The various key employment areas across the borough were considered, and there's an appraisal of existing key employment areas, which is set out at page 142 onwards in the economic needs study, and that considered that they're well located, they're performing well, they're attractive to the market and to employment, people wanting to locate within the borough, and so it was recommended within the economic needs study that those areas should continue to be designated as key employment areas, and opportunities provided for further employment growth within those areas, but also as expansion of those areas as well, which some of those employment sites allow for some of the allocations. So the statement sets that out quite clearly. It provides a summary of the different key employment areas between the under the first question, and the summary at paragraph 28, which confirms that approach.
So in terms of the mix of uses then, so we've got the key employment areas, sort of continuation of existing adopted development plans. You've sort of reappraised and reconsidered them, and come to the conclusion that they continue to serve that sort of role and function as they say, key employment areas. So in terms of the uses that are permitted then, so this is within policy ED1, I think.
Yeah.
So you've got various, you list the sites, you list the defined areas, and then you've got mixes of uses which are appropriate. So how have you reached a conclusion on the appropriate mix of uses then?
Sorry, sir. The uses in the table in ED1 are based on existing combinations of uses and prospective uses, as I understand it. I just looked at the confirmation. Yes, that's correct. The uses which are listed here in terms of their prospective nature and indeed in terms of their existing nature probably need to be refined in light of the changes to the use classes order to be more specific, as it were, by reference to the new categories, particularly in relation to Class E and what future expectations might be in relation to those uses and combinations of uses. So, for example, uses EG 1 to 3 will need to be specified in this table. So it's quite likely that having regard to the existing combination of uses on existing sites and prospective uses on the allocated sites, we're going to need a finer grain approach to the table. And to ensure that any strictly non-employment use, for example, retail provision, which is intended only to support the employment uses, is specifically identified in that capacity. So we don't get standalone applications coming in for retail uses, for example, and that will include any ancillary or supporting cafes, food and drink, and leisure uses, which are intended to maintain the sustainability of the employment areas, but not intended to act as attractants in their own right, which would be an unsustainable approach.
Yeah, I think you've read my mind as to where I was sort of going with that question. I think yes, the table obviously refers to you're correct. It also refers to leisure uses, doesn't it? So I think there needs to be potential look at this table to really sort of narrow down what the uses are intended to be. Obviously, the key focus there is your sort of traditional, as I would call them, B1, B2, B8 uses. And then obviously ancillary sort of small scale sort of retail uses, which would sort of support the main role and function of the key employment site.
That's right, sir. And we need to make this policy more effective in that regard. It's not going to change the focus or the thrust of the policy or the uses which are intended to take place or to be permitted in the future, merely to provide greater certainty to those reading the plan as to what is intended.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've seen some hands go up, so we'll go around the room. We'll go to Peter Waldron first, please. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry, Mr. Waldron.
Sorry, I should have been used to that after so long, but apologies. I think I'm pleased with what I've just heard, but slightly surprised that we've got to this point before that point has been accepted. The way the policy has been worded is a long way from its intention, it appears, and I'll be interested to hear from you, sir, what process will now be followed, because the policy ED1 and indeed elements of ED2 effectively would allow somebody to come in with a retail proposal on a large area of employment land and have full policy support and the full weight of section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act behind it at the current stage. But what I'm hearing is that's not the intention. So how will this all be unpicked? Because there will be a number of references throughout the plan, not just the actual policy wording of ED1, that will need to be amended to reflect what I understand now to be the intended approach. How will that go about being disseminated and consulted upon and indeed examined?
So any changes like this one would need to be wrapped up into a schedule of main modifications. And the main modifications obviously are recommended by myself, and they would then be subject to a full 6-week public consultation. It would be subject to the same consultation that the council carried out at Regulation 19 stage. So it's a full public consultation. The modifications would also be subject, where appropriate, to sustainability appraisal as well. So full public consultation, and then those comments would all come back to myself.
And a further examination session at that point, or you would then take a view on that?
I would take a view on that. In the majority of cases, it wouldn't be necessary to hold further hearings following main modification consultation. Obviously, the public consultation allows for people to make representations in writing, and it would generally, it's only in cases where the main modification process sort of throws up something that's slightly unusual, or somebody points out, that the modification, doesn't do what it's intended to do, something like that. But I think in this case, I think it's quite clear what the council are trying to do, and I would sort of fully support the council in doing that. I think these key employment sites, the policy needs to be more clearly defined and refined to set out what the appropriate mix of uses are.
I completely agree with that. The thing that slightly concerns me is that what we heard is the reference to leisure is intended to retain or maintain the sustainability of the employment areas, not become attractors in their own right. I'm unclear what that means, how a leisure use can maintain the sustainability of an employment area. And indeed, given the amount of potential reference to retail, and indeed the existing retail that exists in some of these locations, quite how much more retail is considered necessary to support the employment use of the area. So whilst I completely agree the policy as it's currently phrased didn't make any sense to me at all, and that appears to have been recognised, I'm just not sure what I'm hearing is actually going to go far enough, because there still seems to be some idea that retail and indeed leisure can support an employment area. So I remain concerned, sir.
Is the intention of the policy so where does it refer to leisure and retail uses? Let's have a look.
It's in the table 12 within the policy wording of ED1.
Yeah, so which of the sites refer to, obviously you've got Royal Tunbridge Wells Town Centre. So does that reflect the town centre boundary then?
Yes, and that was the reference. One of the references I was making. But and Southborough High Brooms, for example, the industrial area, it says appropriate leisure uses. The purpose of this is because leisure or retail uses may be ancillary, in which case they don't attract the attention of policy because they're not primary uses. But it may be appropriate in some cases, in order to assist with sustainability, to provide facilities for the workforce nearby, so they don't have to travel distances or lose a lot of time in order to take time out from work in order to take some exercise or to get food, for example. That's the only intention of this, and that will be that could be made clear. They must be there, as it were, to support the workforce and aid sustainability. So it's not intended that there be located there a gym which is to, for example, cater for a much wider population base. So that's the way we're approaching this. And Mr. Wardren is right. It's not just this policy which will need to be looked at carefully. We will have to look at references throughout the employment section and elsewhere to make sure that references are consistent to the approach taken to these modifications when they're made.
Yeah, and I think the other sort of key thing to think about is where you've got where you've got these key employment areas, you know, as Ms. Evans has pointed out, you know, there's evidence base underpinning this, that they are, as I sort of say in the tin, really key employment areas. So there also needs to be a recognition that, yes, you know, the policy may support small scale ancillary uses, but I think in looking at the word, it needs to be a recognition as well that where they don't undermine the role and function of the key employment area, which is you know, we can come up with some wording. I think it's pretty sort of common, these types of policies. Really, it's about ensuring, you know, you've identified key employment areas, and the uses permitted there will support that role and function, but there may be, like you say, small scale sort of ancillary retail or leisure uses which may actually so, you know, help support and help sustain the primary role and function of these key employment areas.
That's the intention, sir.
Yeah. Okay, Ms. Borland.
Thank you, sir. I'm CPR are very interested in this conversation because a lot of the Longfield Road section of the Royal Tunbridge Wells North Farm Longfield Road key employment area is actually large retail sites. There's 2 large supermarkets. There's a B&Q. There's a couple of other shops. It's retail completely, not ancillary at all. Our point was that as those things are there, we are concerned that we felt that perhaps the usage should also include housing development, because what you've got there is the equivalent of a shopping street. Bigger supermarkets than you would have in many of the neighbourhood centres, and some of those have closed down, and we don't know what the usage is going to be in the future. But certainly one of the main retail outlets that was there, John Lewis, closed a few months ago, and the Argos Superstore, which cannot be called ancillary to the employment use, is due to close in what, later this year. I'm not sure of the exact date. Now, when those sites become available, are they going to be taken on by other large retail units? Or wouldn't it be better to actually allow housing development there to benefit from the sustainability of the site, to support the employment usage, and to support the retail that's there? This and allowing housing development there would also reduce the need to build on greenfield sites elsewhere. This is very much an urban area. It's very much an extension of Royal Tunbridge Wells. Knights Park, the major development, is very, very close to it. As has been pointed out, there are some leisure parts of the development already, a cinema. I don't know if the restaurants are still there. I haven't been there for quite a while, but it's not an employment area as such at the moment from the definitions I've been hearing this morning.
What does the economic needs assessment then say about these types of uses? Because I was just looking at the map actually. So the policies map defines the key employment area. The RTW 17 allocation, I think, is included. I think that becomes the eastern boundary. I think, I can't quite see. But in terms of, yeah, does the B&Q, is it a Curry's sort of shop? Yeah. So that part of the, I think there's the furniture and sort of carpet shop and things like that. So that part of this allocation, is that within the key employment allocation? And if so, the question then becomes, is it justified that is within a key employment allocation, given it sort of has this role as a sort of out of centre retail park?
The economic needs study does discuss the area, and it, at paragraph 9.39, it considers the North Farm Longfield Road key employment area, and there are, as Mrs. Borland stated, there are retail uses within the key employment area. It's evolved over time. There are still a mix of your more traditional B-class uses interspersed with retail as well. So there are areas which are primarily some retail, bulky goods type retailing primarily. But there are, there's B2 uses, there's B1 uses. There's a mix within the area, and I think the boundaries as drawn do reflect that, and we acknowledge that there are retail also within there. But I think they are drawn appropriately, and as we said, we acknowledge there are retail uses within there as well, and some of them have been permitted, at appeal and a means of ways. But in terms of Mrs. Borland's comment about residential, residential wouldn't be appropriate within that area. The key employment areas are primarily employment uses, and there are, car showrooms and sort of B2 industrial uses as well within that area. So residential is not considered appropriate.
I think, yeah, the difficulty becomes if you try and then sort of change the boundary of the key employment area to start excluding individual uses. Like I said, they are sort of interspersed there, so it would become tricky to do that. I think you're right. It probably is justified to have that single boundary. I think what the plan just needs to do, and it's the point, so I can't remember the gentleman's name, but it's the point that you don't want the plan to inadvertently sort of, in essence, allocate this site for retail and leisure uses. It's a key employment area, and that's what it's intended to be. And I think through the modifications that we've talked about, I think the council's well aware of what it needs to do just to sort of tighten that up and make sure that doesn't happen.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Herbert.
Thank you very much, sir. John Herbert, Director of Troy Planning, representing Paddock Town Council today. I think the conversation about clarifying sort of use classes is really helpful, particularly with respect of Class E and with the changes we've had over the last year on that. What I think from the Town Council's perspective, though, is a wider question of the breakdown of Class E, B2 and B8 uses within the key employment areas. So we're talking about some very, very large areas of land here, but it's entirely unclear to the Town Council how the mix of employment types and the different types should be broken down and provided for. And the challenge here is that, of course, there are different employment densities, plot ratios, built forms, traffic movements associated with those different uses. So an entirely Class E office-led development, for example, would generate quite high employment densities, would have a very different urban fabric and form relationship to the street, as opposed to a Class B8 employment warehouse and distribution type development with very much lower employment densities, but higher and different traffic generation, particularly in terms of things like HGV movements. So we're not clear what is actually proposed for the employment areas, what the mix of uses are, and how that relates back to the scale of growth and residential growth in the area, and how it might meet the employment needs and demands of that place, and how it will actually deliver on the aspirations for good growth. We think that requires clarity, and we need more understanding of what the impacts and testing of that have been in terms of traffic impact and sustainability appraisal, for example.
So I think in terms of the specific allocations, certainly at Paddock Wood, we'll come on to talk about those. But in terms of the designation then of land as the key employment area, if we turn to the Paddock Wood map, the designation of the key employment areas at Paddock Wood then, so is this essentially, and again, this is the sort of, it's a line drawn on the map, which is a sort of thick brown line with the triangles, I think. So is that essentially existing employment areas plus the 2 allocations at Paddock Wood? They
Yes.
become part of the key employment area.
Yeah, I think you're right. So there's kind of two elements to this. There's the designation of the key employment areas, which is showing the key employment area washes over the existing employment uses as defined within policy ED1. And then there's also so I think the list of uses within the table reflects that there is a mix of uses within those sites currently, and we would support further, development or sort of redevelopment, or further uses of those types of uses within that area. And then there's the specific allocations, which are shown for Paddock Wood for further employment. So there's kind of 2 elements to the question, I think.
Yeah, I think in terms of the designation of the key employment areas, I think that's clear. Whether or not for areas like, we'll come on to talk about the 2 Paddock Wood sites and whether or not they need to be more clearly defined and more clearly shown. But not within ED1, you make it clear that for this area it includes the 2 site allocations. You could even do that for the Royal Tunbridge Wells site as well, because presumably the RTW17 site becomes part of it's an allocation, but it becomes part of the designation of the wider key employment area.
Yeah, that's the intention, that the key employment area will wrap around the allocated site also. Yeah.
So it's maybe just making that slightly clearer then, that the key employment areas are effectively, it's a designation of land which is covering existing uses, there are existing businesses there, and obviously clearly the policy in the plan is supporting those to sort of adapt, change, expand, etc. But it's also including the specific site allocations, which we'll come on to discuss. Mr. Buckwell.
Yes, good morning. So Jonathan Buckwell, on behalf of a number of people today, including a couple of the allocations at Paddock Wood. Just a very short point from me, sir, just in response to what's been said on behalf of the Town Council. It's important, of course, just to make sure that we do have this flexibility. Take no issue at all with the discussion on Class E uses just now. But when we're looking at B2, B8 and what would have been once B1 light industrial offices, clearly there are some sites which may only be suitable for an office park or may only be suitable for B8 distribution, but where a site is suitable for all of them, we just must have that flexibility to be able to respond to the market needs at any one time, rather than over constraining which of those uses can take place on sites.
Okay, so talks about policy. So the general context of this was really question 1. Question 2 was about the boundaries, and I've started to touch upon that. So the Paddock Wood sites in particular then, and this was a question that cropped up on the Paddock Wood session when we're talking about Paddock Wood strategic sites. The allocations in the plan then, where are they shown? So the employment allocations, where are they shown within the local plan, or where are they identified? Because the policies map for Paddock Wood shows the strategic site allocation that's in the sort of buff colour, and then it's got the key employment area, which we know encompasses the 2 allocations. But do you think the allocations are sort of clearly and adequately defined in the plan?
Thank you, sir. Hannah Young, and I'm the Strategic Sites and Delivery Team Leader for Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. So as you correctly point out, the allocation boundary for the strategic growth around Paddock Wood, so STR SS1 is shown in the buff colour. We haven't differentiated within the proposals map the different uses as perhaps on the smaller allocations, which do show a colour for residential and a colour for employment, due to the nature of the strategic growth. And instead we thought it was appropriate to just shade the allocation in one colour and then have the policy and the maps accompanying the policy STR1 SS1 to set out the different uses in that respect. So as you say, we include the proposed allocation sites within a extended key employment area for Paddock Wood. So the brown line with the arrows goes around the 2 or 3 proposed allocated sites, but they should be read as part of the wider strategic allocation, which is why for the purpose of this we didn't differentiate. That's not to say if you thought it was appropriate to show them and delineate them differently, we would be comfortable in doing that, but that was the rationale to having just the one colour.
So where would we go in the plan then to really understand where the employment allocations are at Paddock Wood?
You would then look at map 28 on page, I think it's 150 of the local plan, which is the structure plan referred to through policy STR SS1, which shows it in purple, the land for employment uses. And it refers you to the policy, which says the sort of proposal for the expansion of Paddock Wood and East Capel, which will deliver the following on the broad locations as identified at map 28. So it's referred to within the wording of the policy. And then part 2G refers to the significant new land for mixed employment uses on sites to the north and south of Lux Lane and to the east of Transvisa Road.
Within that map, there's we touched upon this in the Paddock Wood session. There's a small square parcel of land to the north of the railway line, just beyond the town centre. Is that part of the strategic site allocation then? It is. So that is the unit currently occupied by Bathhouse, an industrial employment operator. That is available. It's come through our core for sites. We've assessed it as part of the Sheila and the sustainability appraisal as part of the wider allocation, and it was considered appropriate to identify it for its redevelopment potential and include it within the strategic sites policy. And the quantum of potential residential units that could be delivered there has been included within the total number of residential units in our policy. And so you've got this map which is in the text of the plan. You've then on the previous page 149 of the plan, you've got the master plan areas. So to the north you've got the northern parcel, which is referred to. So for these two employment sites then, obviously the northern parcel encompasses a lot of land which is just existing employment uses. What's going to be needed of these two employment sites then? Are they going to have to produce a master plan SPD in the same way as the east and west parcels are? So yeah, at the moment we're considering the drafting of the policy SS1, having regard to the comments made at earlier sessions about its effectiveness, and particularly the reliance upon the production of the SPD. And in that review, for the purposes of proposing modifications, we will be making specific requirements in relation to the northern parcel, and specifically the two employment sites there. So they will be identified specifically within the parcel, and the requirements in the production of a master plan for each of those sites to be coordinated
will be a requirement of the policy. The changes which we're considering are reasonably extensive to make the policy effective, and those issues which you're identifying will be addressed as part of that policy redraft. So the range of uses there will be specified within the policy as a means of bringing greater clarity and certainty to what is expected in relation to those development areas, in line with ED1.
Yeah, I think as well in terms of sort of question 2, are they accurately shown? I think it would be helpful. You've got the policies map. It's identified the strategic site. These sites are within that strategic site, and that's fine. But I'm wondering whether when looking at policy ED1, what policy ED1 is saying. We've got these key employment areas. And within these key employment areas, in some instances, we have specific site allocations, RTW17 being one at Tunbridge Wells, these 2 sites at Paddock Wood being the others. In changing ED1, you need to make that obviously clear. And I wonder whether it would also be worthwhile to sort of highlight those on the policies map as well. I appreciate that they are part of the strategic sites, but they are slightly different in the sort of standalone, aren't they? We've heard a lot about the East Parcel and how that's progressed. We've heard a lot about the West Parcel and the statements common ground and the sort of the mass line. But I don't know. We'll come on to hear probably from Mr. Buckwell and others. But it sounds like those parcels, whilst there's a requirement for them to have regard to the sort of wider growth and be integrated with it and everything that goes with that in terms of connectivity and good design. It almost sounds like that they're sort of separate uses that might just come forward as parts of their own sort of individual plan applications potentially. I don't know. Is it?
That's correct. They're being delivered by separate promoters to the housing growth, and as we've confirmed in our hearing statement.
And I think on that basis, you can still have a policy and a plan that says, you are still part of the overall bigger picture. You are still part of the growth at Paddock Wood, and therefore, yes, you've got to think about appropriate layouts, connectivity, design, etc. But just in terms of their actual delivery, it sounds like they're sort of slightly different in that regard. So perhaps should be identified on the policies map as well as actual standalone employment. Well, not standalone, that's not the right word, but just as employment allocations.
That's accepted, sir, and is in line with our current thinking. And I'm hoping that in due course you'll be able to see that expressed clearly in a modified policy.
Okay. Was it Mr. Buckwell? We'll go to the gentleman that's acting on behalf of these site promoters.
Yes, I certainly have no objection to that being shown on the proposals map in that way.
Okay, it would essentially be the same as RTW17 is at Tunbridge Wells. Presumably, it would be similar sort of visual description there. Okay, so we've got these key employment areas, and we've talked about making the policy clear as to what's actually permitted there. So in locations not identified as key employment areas, so somewhere else, maybe a smaller, sort of more localized business park, for example, how would the plan or how would a decision maker react to a development proposal there for maybe the expansion of existing premises or the provision of some new employment uses?
Yeah, so this question's dealt with in the council statement on page 12 and onwards. I think obviously we've got the approach to the key employment areas. In terms of developments or proposals coming forward outside of those areas, the council's response refers to the range of development management policies which we would use to consider and assess any proposals coming forward on. So we've set those out clearly in the statement from pages 12 to 16, and highlighted those policies in particular which would be used for such proposals.
Okay, Ms. Borland.
My video, the host has stopped my video. So I will talk without video. Right, I can start my video now. Right, I have a point to make about the expansion around, potential expansion around Gills Green. Before we go on to that, I just thought I would highlight that the conversation earlier about retail in the North Farm, Longfield Road industrial area. If you look on Google Maps, you will see the very large road sign for the turnoff from the A21 to it, which is to Pembury Hospital and to the retail and business parks. So it's actually recognised as retail parks down there as well as business parks. So I just thought I'd mention that, which explains why. Yeah, I've lived in the area for over 20 years, possibly 30 years, and in the majority of that time, it has always been considered a retail park by residents. That was where we went for various bits of shopping. In turn, moving on to the expansion of existing new buildings outside key employment areas, I understand that the LBD around the Gills Green key employment area in Hawkhurst is going to be removed. Now, we can understand the logic of that because it's some distance from the settlement of Hawkhurst. And I believe the council's policy is that it's the settlements that should have limits to built development. But CPRE is concerned that that there's a risk because there's built development being allowed in an area of the AONB. It's defined as a key employment area, but what's to stop it kind of spreading? We've established the principle that you can build in the AONB there because it's a key employment area. So what happens when somebody comes along and wants to put up an employment building half a mile away, next door, outside the key employment area? I'm not sure that there's protections for that in terms of the AONB. Thank you, sir.
Yes, just take me then to let's sort of use a practical example then. So we've got we've got a business that they want to sort of set up or expand some existing buildings. That's they're not within one of these key employment areas. So what policy would they go to determine whether or not they are sort of going to be approved or not?
I think in terms of Gills Green, I think we've got a specific discussion on the Gills Green key employment area in terms of the allocation and the extent of that. In terms of a general point, I'd refer you to the policies that are listed on page 16 of the council statement, where it does set out in particular the environmental policies that proposals will be considered against. We've got sort of the general.
But just in terms of the principle of it, then, I mean, presumably, so correct me if I'm wrong. Presumably, then, is if you're in a settlement, you're within the limits to build development of a settlement. Let's say you're in Royal Tunbridge Wells somewhere, you're not within any of the key employment areas, but there's some existing buildings there. You've got an existing business and you want to expand it or knock the buildings down, create new ones, etc., etc. Presumably, in principle, subject to all other things being considered, design, highways, residential amenity, congestion, etc., etc., that would be acceptable.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
and it would just be considered against policy EN1, sustainable design, which is the sort of overarching policy. So it's coming back to sort of considering the plan as a whole.
So where does just in terms of the strategy then, just in terms of understanding that, where would, again, so I'm a local business owner, where I picked up the plan, where would I go to understand that, yeah, I'm within the limits to built development, you know, in principle, subject to sourcing everything out, I'm good to go with this development. Where would it set that out? Would it be one of the strategic policies?
Yes, so
Policies?
STR2, place shaping and design, and then development management policy EN1.
So what does STR2 say? Again, that talks about design, does it not?
Yes.
I think what we talked about this on the strategy day, and we talked about some potential changes to policy STR1 to make it clear. I think it was criterion 2. So within policy STR1,
yes, sorry, STR1, yeah.
Yeah, this goes back to the discussion, doesn't it, about criterion 2 says that the local plan looks to focus new development within the limits to built development of settlements, where proposals are called with that. And we talked about this, and I think that could be just made clearer for effectiveness. I think what you're trying to say is that, you know, in principle, new development will be supported within limits to built development. I think that's what the plan's trying to say. And, you know, again, it goes back to that point about, again, you might be a house, you know, you might have a windfall site within the limits to built development, and there's nothing within the plan that really says that that's acceptable. So it's just making it clear as part of that strategy is that if you're in a limits to built development, and we've talked about why the council have defined them, that, you know, subject to proportionate to the sort of role and function of that settlement, that in principle it'd be acceptable. I think Mr. Marlowe had his hand up, but it just went down again.
Sorry, sir. I did take my hand down largely because you'd essentially said what I was going to say. We did have this discussion in relation to policy STR1, and the council did undertake to make it more of a development management policy, as well as just setting the overall approach, and that's something we are doing as you've just described.
Yeah. So yeah, could say new housing employment uses will be permitted within limits to built development, etc. So yeah, I think that's the point. I think when I read the plan, especially in the context of, okay, you've got your key employment areas, subject to change in the policy, I know what's going to be permitted there, but it was just that, you know, another scheme that would still be within a perfectly suitable location. It just wasn't in a key employment area, making sure that the plan would adequately support that, clearly subject to highways, residential amenity, etc. Yeah, okay, that's question 3. Any other sort of questions, observations before we get into some of these sites then? Okay, we'll start to look at some of the sites, and we'll stop for a break as we go through. So we'll take the first 1 or 2 maybe. So the first one then is RTW17, which is land adjacent to Longfield Road, Royal Tunbridge Wells. And we've talked about this one on previous days. So again, just update me. So this has now got full plan permission or outline permission?
Yes, as I think we touched on this one at the employment needs session, matter 2, issue 2. Yes, this site has outline planning permission, and that's referred to in relation to question 2 in the council statement, and we stated there at paragraph 20 that that it has existing planning permission, and there's been ongoing discussions in relation to that site coming forward.
In terms of the mix of uses then, let me just go to the policy. Does the plan and the permission sort of adequately sort of marry up? Is there any sort of discrepancies between the two, mindful that, you know, an alternative scheme could come forward?
Yes, so the consented scheme allows for 74,000 square metres of floor space, and I think also in relation to question 2, the council's response does set that out. The allocation is set out as providing for approximately 80,000 square metres, and that was based on the assessment of the site and what it was considered could be achieved on there. So, you know, it's an approximate figure, and I think, you know, obviously the consented scheme as it came forward has demonstrated that the 74,000 could be achieved on there, and I think that's appropriate. And you know, the policy it stays as it is in terms of the 80,000, and that reflects, you know, if an alternative scheme came forward, or we could consider that.
And so if you go look at the policy itself, then, so it refers to the allocation on the inset map, allocated for use class E uses, E uses to approximately 80,000 square metres net office, general industrial and storage and distribution. Does the plan or the policy then differentiate between the different uses? So is it 80,000 square metres of office, or is it a sort of mix of everything? What does the permitted scheme do?
So the allocation doesn't specify it specifies the mix of uses, but it doesn't specify quantums for the individual B classes. The permitted scheme is addressed in relation to your question 3, the council's response on page 10 of the council statement, and that does set out that the consented scheme does have limits on the floor space, and that was as a result of the discussions as part of that scheme and the proposals and what was appropriate. So I think we said there at so paragraphs 25 and 26, I think the allocation allows for flexibility for proposals coming forward of what would be appropriate at that time, but we recognise that the consented scheme does have limits for each floor, you know, for each use class.
Do you think then that needs to be reflected in the policy, be either setting out the limits or through a caveat in the policy that it's essentially saying that it's not 80,000 square metres of office, for example?
Yeah, I think we don't think it would be necessarily appropriate to be specific in the policy to reflect what the consented scheme has got, because I think we need to provide the flexibility within the allocation policy itself, but except we could put some wording in there in term to make it clear that 80,000 square metres would be a mix of uses, not just one use. So we could look at some wording to make that a little bit clearer.
Yeah, I think if as part of the application process, the council has determined that the 80,000 square metres of office, for example, you know, whether that would ever come forward anyway, but the council's determined that wouldn't be appropriate, then it just needs maybe a caveat in there to say that it's yes, the policy is about flexibility, but it's not it's not 80,000 square meters of one particular use, because presumably does the policy, I don't know, is the council looking for a mix of uses there, or would the council actually be sort of happy with just a single office development, or sort of single B8 development? No, I think the council's looking for a mix of uses. Obviously, it's a sort of strategic allocation in employment terms, and to provide for employment uses over the plan period. And I think a range of employment type uses would be what we would want to see on the site. Yeah, but it could be as straightforward as that. Then just making sure that it's providing a mix of providing a mix of uses of office, general industrial and storage and distribution up to 80,000 square metres.
Yeah.
Would be one way of doing it. In terms of the sort of site area then and sort of scale of development, so a bit of a recurring theme looking at this sort of site layout plans, which is map 17. I think within the hearing statement you said that the employment use, which is sort of teal blue colour, you said that in the approved scheme that's slightly different. Does that make the submitted plan unsound, or would you just suggest that actually, the plan is still sound and justified? Yes, the plan application is slightly different, or would you suggest that no, this needs to be changed?
No, I think we would want to keep it as it is, and draw your attention to Appendix 1 of the hearing statement, where we've just provided a sort of a slightly different version of map 17, the site layout plan, which sort of clearly shows the extent of the permitted scheme and the extent of the allocation boundary as well.
So I would just add that obviously the allocation was based on a very particular scheme that made its own sort of justification, both in terms of sort of quantum and layout. So the boundary that we've proposed within the plan is based on the detailed work that we undertook with the landscape and visual impact assessment for HDA. Which is set out in document CD 3.96B, and that identifies the area and the appropriate landscaping that has been recommended and we've taken forward to the policy.
Yeah, and obviously within the council's hearing statement, you set out in quite some detail there about the sort of the reasons and rationale for the area and the different areas. In terms of the open space and landscape buffer, again, for sort of residential allocations, we've talked about the reasons why these are included for the allocation. As part of the approved scheme then, is there any detail on what that area would be used? Is it just going to be planting? Is it sort of going to be accessible open space? Is it going to be part of the development? What was envisaged for that area?
The primary purpose of the additional space is landscape and ecological mitigation. It will, however, offer some amenity use for those who are working on the site. But in addition, there is a footpath that runs east-west on the northern boundary of the area proposed for built development. You'll be aware, so this is major development in the ANOB. It is a considerable size scheme that needs justification, and the mitigation is important both for landscape and biodiversity, and also those improvements go towards the greenbelt argument as well. The application did not use at that time the deframetric. Used a bespoke metric to justify net gain, and there were some concerns of whether that allocation would actually be able to meet, whether the application would meet 10%. It would certainly, we agreed at the time, it would meet a gain, but application of the new metric, which we're now up to metric 3.1, we think the additional land is justified.
In terms of the sort of the AONB considerations, then again we've talked about changes to policies of sites within AONBs to add additional wording to consider matters if alternative schemes come forward. But in terms of sort of considering the exceptional circumstances necessary to alter the greenbelt boundary, but also the circumstances necessary to justify major development within the AONB. What justification is there then for the allocation? What factors did you take into account when one thing that we discussed on the day where we talked about employment needs was this issue, and representatives have made this point that you've got allocations in places like Hawkhurst, you've got allocations in places like Paddock Wood, and we've got we talked about sort of new employment as as part of Tudor Village, for example. So there was a suggestion then that you don't potentially need this site, and conversely, if you do have this site, you then don't need others, the likes of Tudor Village and others. So taking this into account, the need for employment and the expected supply from other schemes elsewhere, and the sort of oversupply that we talked about, what is the justification for allocations such as this one then, where you've got major development in the AONB and in the Greenbelt?
I'll let Ms. Banks tell you a bit more about the actual economic justification and so on. But before she does so, I would just point out that Natural England did discuss about whether this site should be called in. In the end, they decided not to do so. And I would take you to the Statement of Common Ground for Natural England, which is CD 3.132C brackets 5, appendices H to J, pages 115 to 161, and paragraph 9.6. And in there, paragraph 9.6 and 9.7. So although Natural England objected to plan applications on the basis of it being major development within the AONB, and as the statement says elsewhere, this was an in-principle objection, it did not seek calling. And it goes on to say it is appreciated that there are more limited alternatives in terms of the location of major development relating to that for housing. In light of the extant planning permission, it is agreed that the requirements of the policy provide a helpful framework for development management. So that's the position with regard Natural England and the AONB, and I'll pass you over to Ms. Banks.
Sorry, yeah, it's actually me coming back on this one. Yeah, in terms of the justification for the employment land, I think we sort of explored that at the previous session on the employment needs, and I'd just refer back to our statement really in response to your question 7, paragraph 70 of our statement considered this sort of oversupply and employment land provision and set out the justification for that. And I think again it's sort of, we highlighted the some of the specific allocations that are made within the in the local plan, this being one of them, the land at King's Standing Way, and the particular benefits that site offers in terms of economic development, in the strategic location, but also some of the other areas, like Gills Green, for example, serving that rural area. So I think we've sort of discussed that at previous session.
But in terms of the sort of employment side of things, for the strategy on housing, we talked a lot about, okay, you could actually meet housing needs beyond the green belt, but we talked a lot about the strategy and the need to sort of promote sustainable patterns of development in particular, and how, yes, you'd end up with sort of housing focus a long way from Royal Tunbridge Wells in more rural areas. Is it the same conclusions and the same considerations for this sort of large employment site then? Were those sort of the factors that were taken into account? Did you consider that, well, potentially, in terms of meeting your local plan needs, you could just rely on other sites elsewhere?
Yes, this was considered, and there are specific, specific merits of the sites that have been allocated for employment use, and again, the economic needs study provides the information that's informed the local plan, particularly land at King's Standing Way and its locational advantage there, and I think that needs to be taken into account, in terms of economic development and providing sites that are suitable but attractive to the market as well. I think that's it. That's a key consideration with these.
I just wanted to add to that, sir, that in addition, the landscape sensitivity study and the Greenbelt study did show this to have perform better than a great many other sites in terms of effects, which we can discuss a bit more detail if you wish, but they're set out in our hearing statement.
Through the SA, did the council consider any reasonable alternatives for meeting employment needs, so alternative employment sites?
Yes, it did.
Okay, any comments just on this there? So council statement's quite thorough and comprehensive in terms of the Greenbelt and A and B considerations. Obviously mindful as well, this site's got planning permission, but Ms. Borland, any comments?
Thank you, sir. Yes. Is this the time to raise points about the safeguarding of land at Colebrook House, which is adjacent to this site?
Very, very nearly. I was just going to see if there's any questions, and then yes, that is next on my list of questions. So maybe hold that thought for 5 minutes.
Okay, I will do. I'll go away. Thank you very much.
Mr. Buckwell.
Sarah, I was going to ask exactly the same question as Ms. Borland.
Well, that makes it easy then. We can move straight onto it then. So yes, we talked about the Greenbelt. We talked about the Greenbelt boundary at that session. So we had a session earlier in, I think it was the start of May, wasn't it? Where we talked about the Greenbelt boundary then. So let me just pull up the relevant extracts from the policies map. So yeah, so in terms of the Greenbelt boundary then, and again, by way of sort of introduction to this and as a recap, it's helpful for other people that weren't at that session. So when we were talking about the principle of Greenbelt release and the council sort of methodology and how they'd considered Greenbelt release, this issue cropped up then. So this is land to the east of the allocation, and it's proposed to be removed from the Greenbelt, but doesn't have a particular land use, so would be outside limits to built development, would not be allocated for anything in particular. So sort of hand over to the council. Really. I did say we'd come back to it. I did say I was sort of slightly concerned about what the justification for this was. Obviously, it would have to meet the same exceptional circumstances tests. So is this something you've sort of considered further?
So I'll pick this up. Thank you. Yes, David Marlowe for the Borough Council. I should have introduced myself earlier. I think just looking at the genesis of this, the economic needs study that Ms. Evans referred to doesn't specifically consider Colebrook House. It did, of course, consider the expansion of North Farm, as has been said, so strongly recommended that as an important sort of site for economic growth, but did also refer to the A21 corridor as providing an appropriate opportunity if there were suitable sites to provide sort of flexibility. In the light of that and the submission from of the site, the council did put it forward in the draft local plan as an allocation, essentially through the conversion of the existing substantial property, Colebrook House itself, together with a sort of a modern business park and a campus layout. However, I think following the draft local plan and having regard to the overall employment land supply on the one hand, and also Greenbelt harm, which is overall was moderate, amongst other considerations. it was concluded that it would be still with potential with the accessibility and visual containment, that it may well be a suitable site for employment in the future, and therefore rather than release Greenbelt at a future plan review, the conclusion was that it should be released from the Greenbelt now and safeguarded for future use, obviously in line with the MPPF through a review of the local plan. In the meantime, I think, obviously countryside policies would apply. I think there is a discussion which the council acknowledges whether there should actually be a specific safeguarding policy relating to this land to make that abundantly clear, and that's something we're sort of happy to consider, but that's the sort of the background to where we are.
In terms of the principle of that, then obviously the council said that there was no justification to allocate it, and it isn't an allocated site, so it's not a site that's allocated in the plan. And what the council said as well, there was no justification to do so. How do you know? So if you safeguard this for this sort of office campus style development, you safeguard it for that, how do you know that that in the next review of the local plan that would still be an appropriate strategy? Because the site would have been taken out of the Greenbelt, so it would no longer be part of the Greenbelt. How do you know then that would definitely be the next focus for growth? There'd be a need for it, that this scheme would be meeting that need, when you've sort of concluded that need doesn't exist? How are you certain then that it will do in the future, and that this would be the sort of most logical next place to go to meet that need? Compared to other, compared to a comparative assessment of other sites, be it at Paddock Wood, be it similar sized sites around the edge of Rolton Bridge Wells.
I think it's aside from the question of the sort of whether there should be the sort of policy protection that ensures it is retained for employment use, I think the council's had a mind to look at employment needs in the sort of years beyond the plan period, and there are and obviously it has the benefit of the site assessment work through the Sheila already, and there are very few opportunities. We haven't identified any other sites with such sort of convenient access to the A21, adjoining the existing, what will be the expanded largest employment area in the borough and the largest settlement. So this is at this point in time the most likely, the most obvious sort of candidate for future employment. Accepting what you say, we cannot be certain, and indeed the local plan review would need to consider whether it is still appropriate to safeguard it, or indeed whether there are the exceptional circumstances, then need to actually redesignate it as Greenbelt would be one of the options. But I think at this point the council is feeling that this is a potential site, the most likely site for future employment growth in years beyond the planned period, and is looking just to safeguard that position.
In Greenbelt terms as well, then you'd be left with so presumably the boundary of the area of Greenbelt that you've sought to remove is the boundary of the site. You'd obviously be left then with a sort of pocket of Greenbelt to the south of that, so to the south of Colebrook House and to the east of RTW17. So do you think that the amending the Greenbelt boundary in this way would provide long-term defensible Greenbelt boundary and everything that the framework requires us to consider? Or do you think there'd be pressure then for that last pocket of land just to come forward as well?
I think so. That's obviously something that the council would have to consider at the time. I think we're at the point at the moment of, are there exceptional circumstances to justify the release of land from the green belt? There certainly aren't the sort of exceptional circumstances in relation to the land to the south of Colebrook House. And I say, it is. It probably is important in terms of the sort of the setting of the approach to Tunbridge Wells at that area at that point. It doesn't have the same visual containment as the rest of Colebrook House. I think it is quite critical. But as I say, there are the land, Colebrook House, and that land would still remain outside of the limits to built development. It is still an area of outstanding natural beauty, and so all proposals will be considered against those in the interim. As I say, there is perhaps a question mark over whether, subject to your views on this, of course, if it's whether there's a need to clarify that in line with the NPPF, that development wouldn't be allowed on it, and that which would prejudice its future development within this plan period, or within this plan, I should say.
So I just wanted to add a little bit to what Mr. Marlowe has said in relation to the land to the south of Colebrook House. If you look at the plan, the inset plan, there is clearly the boundary to the A21, and that land to the south of Colebrook House and to the east of RTW 17 is nearly all mitigation land for the A21 widening, and is an area of replanted ancient or translocated ancient woodland. And there's a long-term commitment by the Highways Agency to maintain that woodland as part of the development of the or widening of the A21.
The other consideration that you've got, the other consideration that you've got here is that it is within the AONB and the Greenbelt, and essentially what you're saying is that RTW 17 was justified. RTW 17 was justified due to sort of its site-specific circumstances, and you've set out in detail a lot of the consideration that you took into account. Obviously, with the benefit of the plan application process, has allowed you to do that. By seeking to remove this land from the green belts and safeguarding it for future employment uses, you are effectively saying that that site will come forward for employment uses in the future. That is where we are going next. So as part of the preparation of the plan, have you given consideration to any of those factors? Landscape character, accessibility, highways, all the considerations that you gave to RTW 17 and all the considerations which led you to believe that RTW 17 was an appropriate site. Have you done the same thing then with this parcel of land?
So yes, RTW 13 is, it's listed as RTW 13 in the landscape and visual impact assessment by HDA. It's also included in the Greenbelt study, and it's also included in the landscape sensitivity study. So the considerations and the detail assessment has been applied equally to this site in terms of landscape and so on, as it has to the adjacent site.
Okay, let's take some views on this. We'll go to Mr. Buckwell first, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Speaking on behalf of the landowner here, just taking first of all that last point just raised by Mr. Scully there. You will have seen the hearing statement that we've produced for this session, setting out why we believe it it's important to keep this site excluded from the Greenbelt in the manner that the council are suggesting. We have referred in there to a number of points from the landscape study that that Mr. Scully's just mentioned. So the references are in our statement there, sir. Agree with pretty much everything that Mr. Marlowe has just said. What I would certainly do, sir, is invite you to come and have a look at the site yourself if you haven't already. It is really quite a unique site. It is previously developed land. There is an existing substantial house on the site, which is also a non-designated heritage asset. There is a real opportunity to do something with that property. It is in need of something happening to it, and it's a site that we've been in discussions with the council about for a number of years now. As we've set out in our evidence, very much looking originally at an office park. Obviously, the office market has changed substantially in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. But certainly there was a real opportunity here at a time where the council has been losing a lot of office space to residential uses in the town centre. There was a real opportunity here to do something really quite exciting on this site. It's extremely different in character to the site next door that's been allocated. This is very much a large country house in its own parkland. It needs an awful lot of work doing to it, but it is extremely well contained. Pretty much everyone I have been on site with before has commented, goodness me, I never even knew this was here. And this site is right next to the A21 with its own access directly onto the A21, avoiding the existing Longfield Road junction. So there is a real opportunity to do something here. We've identified the idea of an office campus there before, which would be very much in a parkland setting, very different to what you might have next door. But there may be other opportunities that the site is suitable for in future as well, that would generate employment too. There has very recently been some very significant interest in the potential of the site as a hotel type operation as well, which would also go hand in hand with the uses next door. So we certainly see this as a site which is likely to come forward at some point. It is brownfield, it is very well contained. It makes perfect sense, as the NPPF paragraph 143 says, that at a time where the council is reviewing its greenbelt boundaries, it should be considering sites like this. I take the point that you raised about whether there is any guarantee that there will be a need at the next local plan review. But surely I think the same could be said for any safeguarded land policy anywhere. That's the whole point of safeguarded land, isn't it? It's that there may be no guarantee of a need right now, but it can be envisaged going forward. But I think the very unique characteristics of this site make it very different from other sites around, and certainly do justify taking it out of the green belt and safeguarding it in this way.
In terms of its existing use then, and yes, yes, it will be one that I'll need to go and visit. So that will be arranged through the programme officer. But if you could contact Charlotte in the first instance to arrange that, then obviously, yes, obviously all the sites that we've been talking about this week and last week, I'll need to go and look at and consider. If it's the case then that this site is going to come forward, and obviously you've talked about various different things there about, it needs investment, etc. When is that likely to occur? Because obviously if you went down the safeguarded route, then it would be it'd be safeguarded. It wouldn't be coming forward in this plan period. Does that sort of tie in with aspirations of the landowner then in terms of what they're seeking to do?
Well, there is no specific scheme that we're bringing forward right now, other than we have drawn up this office park scheme in the past. Obviously, the market has been subdued for that more recently. But yeah, there certainly is a possibility that could come forward at some time in the short to medium future, or some other employment generating scheme on the site. If there was a proposal to allocate the site, would always be in support of that, as we have been previously. But certainly removing the Greenbelt hurdle would help enormously in terms of being able to bring the site forward. In the meantime, we'd clearly need to make a case for that. But obviously, if we're looking at a local plan review, that would be coming forward within 5 years, and hopefully within that time period, we've been in a much clearer position about where we wanted to be. But yeah, clearly, being a brownfield site in this location, if there was an opportunity to bring it forward sooner, we'd be in support of that.
Same question for the council, really, but from a slightly different angle. Then it is, what would, obviously it's not safeguarded in the submission version of the local plan. It's just removed from the green, but it's not identified. So in order to make the plan sound, what do you envisage, or what would you propose? What do you think is necessary then for this site in terms of maybe a policy, a designation? What are you seeking to do?
So I'll pick up on that. I think, hearing the discussion, our own thoughts are that simply removing it from the green belt without any clear policy expression of its status is perhaps not sufficient. I've heard what Mr. sort of Buckwell says, and he's not putting forward any evidence of sort of market demand at the moment. Ironically, perhaps, except in respect of a hotel, which I should say there is a very good photograph of the existing premises in the LVIA that Mr. Scully referred to, where you see it in its setting, and I can very well see that converting to a hotel, possibly with extensions within the green belt as an option. But as I say, we are limited on employment opportunities going forward. I should also say, in terms of the present situation, I take Mr. Buckwell's point. It is a different setting, very much so, from RTW 17, but nevertheless, through the planning application process, office uses form the larger part of the total floor space that's proposed as part of the application, some 2/3. So I think we are well provided for with offices within the plan period, as well as through in the town centre, and there have been, as I think Mr. Bourne mentioned much earlier on, in terms of a number of Article 4 directions that have been made. So we're certainly not. We aren't certain at the moment. So I think there's a consideration in terms of either whether the it does warrant a safeguarding now, given that we can review it in 5 years anyway. If we were to safeguard it, then I would suggest that it would need a policy to the effect that that it is safeguarded for future employment uses, and that it is not allocated for development during this plan period, and will be treated as greenbelt pending a review of the local plan, and that also any development that constitutes appropriate development in the greenbelt, which of course could be permitted, would only be allowed if it didn't prejudice the future use. So I think we would need to probably make those clarifications through a policy, where you're minded to agree that it should be safeguarded.
Mr. Buckwell, just your views on that, and then I'll bring in Ms. Borland.
Yes, it's our strong view that there are compelling reasons to remove the site from the green belt now, especially given its status as previously developed land, especially given the need for clearly defined boundaries to the green belt. The council's own evidence makes it very clear that the A21 here and the tree screening around the site make very good solid boundaries to the green belt here. Certainly got no issue with needing to make a case for development in future. Certainly got no issue with making a case against countryside policies, but I think there's a strong reason to take it out of the green belt now. I appreciate we don't have firm proposals, and it is not being set out as a firm allocation right now. But I see no reason why the site can't be removed from the green belt, given its brownfield nature and its clear potential for some form of economic development to come forward on the site.
Obviously, you talked about, you know, hotel use, for example, and different uses there. Given that it is previously developed land, would the framework not support its redevelopment anyway, either through conversion or redevelopment?
I think so. In terms of conversion, yes, it would. The reality is, and we're at an early stage in terms of looking at the hotel uses. This is something that has arisen very recently, which is why we've not made significant representations on it before. But there is clear and very serious interest in that at the moment. I think the reality is, to make that work financially, it is almost certain there would have to be some additional development in the grounds to make that stack up as a viable proposition. Whilst the house is a substantial house, it is almost certainly going to require some additional development in the grounds. Now, obviously, that can be tested against Greenbelt policy in terms of very special circumstances, but we feel that there is the justification to remove it from the Greenbelt now, which will clearly make it easier to deliver economic development as soon as there is the clear case for it on this site.
Okay, we'll go to Ms. Borland. She's been waiting her hand up, so we'll go to Ms. Borland.
Thank you very much, sir. The question from C. Perry is, why release it from the green belt now? There just doesn't seem to be any logic to it. The plan, it's already agreed that the plan is providing more employment land than is understood to be needed. The world of work is changing. It's changed so much in the past few years. Working from home, part-time working. Retail has changed tremendously. The big thing in retail now will be warehousing. We're not talking about a need for this site to come forward. So why are we going to release it from the Greenbelt? Why are we talking even about safeguarding it? It just doesn't seem logical. If it needs to be released from the Greenbelt and safeguarded because something comes forward, then do it at the next plan review, surely. And in terms of Mr. Buckwell's points about hotels, I presume he hasn't read the proposals for Mableton House, which in principle there is going to be left within the Greenbelt, but with a major hotel development at it. CPRA didn't object to the allocation of ALTW 17 as a new business park because we recognised that there were economic benefits for that in the current plan period. For the land at Colebrook House, it just seems to be, the view is, well, we might as well do it, no real reason not to. And I find that very, very harsh when you're talking about releasing Greenbelt. And yes, there may be things that protect the land to the south of it. But I believe when Knights Park was agreed as a development on the other side, further south beside the A21 or near the A21, it was very clear that the protection of the strip of greenbelt between that development and the A21 was important and had to be kept as undeveloped. Surely we should be looking at the same sort of principles for the greenbelt strip along here, that you are developing towards the Capel area of greenbelt on the, I'm going to get my east and west, right on the west side of the A21. It just seems completely illogical to do something that you don't need to do when it's impacting greenbelt land. And as I said, hotel, even office within a contained environment might be appropriate development in the greenbelt. Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Buckwell.
Yeah. Yes, sir. I mean, in response, I think it's important that there is a choice of employment sites for employers to go to. There is clearly the large allocation next door to this site. We don't know if that is going to come forward because it's in the control of one landowner who is currently looking to sell the site. Now, I'm not suggesting that it won't come forward, but there is always a risk. You don't know if the office market in Tunbridge Wells comes back to life. And for whatever reason, the site next door isn't brought forward for office uses, either because it's not brought forward at all, or because it's brought forward entirely for or substantially for other uses, such as distribution or whatever else. Come back to the point that this is a really well screened brownfield site, which has been identified as being suitable for office uses. This isn't just a case of saying, well, we might as well put it forward. There is a clear case which we have been arguing for years, and which the council has recognised, that this makes a good employment site. It also has the benefit of being adjacent to the allocation next door. We have the opportunity to provide a really good pedestrian cycle link between the site next door and the A21. Where you've got the non-motorised route all the way down to Tunbridge that runs alongside this site. There are lots of good reasons to look at development on this site, which can all be achieved without it being visible or affecting the landscape around it, as has been recognised in the council's own studies.
Okay, thank you. Anything final from the council? Then, yeah, I think it's certainly one for me to go and look at before reaching a sort of firm conclusion either way on this one.
Yes, I think we're very much in your hands. You've heard all the arguments. If in the end you think it's an appropriate course of action to safeguard, then we will have to think about a policy which provides a necessary protection for the land and clearly sets out the council's intention for its future use, so that it doesn't come forward for inappropriate development, other forms of inappropriate development in the meantime.
Okay, thank you. Want to move on to the Paddock Wood sites, but we'll have a break first before we do so. So it's just coming to 11:15, so we'll take a 15-minute break if that's okay, and we'll resume back at 11:30 then, please. Okay, thanks everybody. It's 11:30, so we'll resume and continue. Want to move on to talk about the allocated sites as part of the Paddock Wood strategic sites. We can probably take these two sites together, and really it's a sort of continuation of the discussion we had earlier on this morning, insofar as, do you think that the plan is sufficiently clear, the sort of the type, scale and amount of development that will be permitted on both of these allocations? Or if not, do you think that some changes to the plan may be necessary?
Thank you, sir. I think, as we've sort of explained in the hearing statement, we did consider it was clear, and we sought not to be too repetitive through this policy and not repeat other policies in the plan. So, as sort of stated, policy STR SS1, which is the main overarching strategic policy for the growth around Paddock Wood, does make provision for significant new land for a mix of employment uses. That's under criterion 2G, and that specifically then refers to policy and refers the reader of the plan to policy ED1, which we obviously touched upon this morning, which is going to be refined, but that sets out the range of uses. We then have table 5 in the plan, which is linked to the strategic policy STR1, which sets out the quantum of uses. So we did consider it was clear, but we take on board your comment, and we do consider that it would be it could be made clearer, and I think we'd be looking to do that within any amended policy, so that we set out the scale and mix of uses that would be sort of permitted on this site.
Yeah, so table 5 is on page 43 of the local plan, isn't it? And that sets out the allocations and the size, essentially. Yeah. So it's whether that should be made clearer, essentially, that information elsewhere in the plan, to make it abundantly clear that, yeah, these two sites are allocated. Their areas are, I think it's 4.6 and 6.6 hectares, and what they're allocated for. So in terms of what they're allocated for at the moment, that's found within policy ED1, then, is it?
It is. It is. You've got the Paddock Wood Transvisa Road, east and west, and I think, as we commented on this morning, we do need to do work to that table. It's what was previously your B1, so that range of Class C, along with Class B2 and B8.
Okay, so just obviously take some views then on this suggested change by the council, which I think I'd support, in terms of just making the plan just sort of really abundantly clear then as to these two sites that are allocated, you know, the size of the sites which is set out in table 5, and their uses which is set out in ED1. So the information's all there. It's just putting it together in a slightly clearer manner, really.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, sir. I think that's right. And one of the ways in which that can also be facilitated is through the modifications which we're going to be proposing to SS1 as well.
Yeah, and they would be for effectiveness, just making sure that people know exactly what these sites are, and the type of uses. But you're right, it would be I still refer to B1, B2, B8, but it's those type of uses, isn't it? Yeah. Mr. Herbert.
Thanks very much. I think just from my understanding of that sounds very helpful. I think I'm right in saying that we're talking about a breakdown of different types of use and a sort of quantum of those for the employment sites in Paddock Wood, which I think would give the Town Council comfort. I think the question then from the Town Council, and I alluded to that earlier, is has any testing been undertaken of the different types of employment uses within those areas, and what the implications of those might be on things like traffic movements or meeting the employment needs of a growing community, given the different employment densities, built form, traffic generation of different types of employment. I think in terms of clarity as well, the supporting text to policy SS1 refers to high quality employment, but we're not clear from the policy whether that's SS1 or ED1 what is actually meant by high quality, and where we need to read across to understand what those aspirations for high quality are.
Presumably, in terms of also the concerns around testing highways, for example, obviously at the plan application stage, there's plenty of other policies within the local plan which would, if for example, one of these sites came forward and it was all B8 or it was all B1, then there'd be presumably other policies within the plan that would allow for appropriate consideration at that stage.
There are indeed, and also I think it's worth noting that our transport modelling for the local plan obviously took on board these employment allocations, and that applied a worst case scenario to the employment modelling, if you like. So I think that was a sort of assuming it would all be B1, which it won't be, but that's the higher level generation of traffic generation. So it took the worst case scenario in trip generation to give us the comfort that when planning applications come forward, they won't have a significant adverse impact on the highway network and would therefore meet the MPPF tests to determine the planning application.
Yeah, and I agree with these things. Obviously, the plan needs to give sufficient flexibility that could obviously B1, B2, or BA uses, but recognising that there's other policies in the plan that would adequately control the appropriate mix. Mr. Buckwell.
Yes, just to confirm, so no objection to that approach at all. Likewise, I would agree. And as I said earlier, I don't like to see arbitrary floor space limits placed on individual uses where those can be avoided. No issue at all with the requirement for a mix of uses within a site, but really that needs to be tested at the planning application stage, I would say.
Yeah. I agree. Okay. That's for question 8, really. Question 9 was about how these sites will be delivered. And I asked, will they be tied to delivery of new housing or developed individually? So I'm not sure if this is a question for the council or maybe even Mr. Buckwell or others then. So obviously I've seen the representations from obviously the parties promoting these sites. What is the idea envisaged with the 2 employment site allocations? Are they intended to be delivered alongside the housing, or are they just going to come forward as individual plan applications?
Thank you. Perhaps if I go first, and then if there's anything Mr. Buckwell or others on the call want to input afterwards. So there's 2, if you like, 2 broader sites within Paddock Wood, but the land to the east of Maidstone Road is comprised of 2 different site promoters, if you like, land to the north of Lux Lane and land to the south of Lux Lane. So they're sort of 2 allocations, but to be delivered in three applications. They are being promoted separately to the housing promoters. So we are anticipating that the planning applications will come forward as standalone employment applications rather than being tied to the delivery of housing, which we consider is appropriate. They've all have sort of different trajectories, if you like. Swatlands Farm, which is land to the south of Lux Lane, have very recently submitted a planning application, so are going to look to be coming forward in the shorter term. So whilst they're not linked to the delivery of the housing, because they form part of this wider strategic policy, which requires the expansion of Paddock Wood as a garden settlement, they will be required to provide, and I think we'll probably move on to it as the next question, but provide the linkages and be delivered to the garden settlement principles accordingly. But simply speaking, that they'll be delivered separately to the housing.
Just going back to that requirement that I touched upon this morning, then for the SPD, then for this sort of northern area, let's just go back to the policy for Paddock Wood. So would these 2 applications be required to do any wider master planning SPD work then?
They are required to do that. As appended to our hearing statement, David Locke Associates, who prepared the structure plan, have prepared draft high-level master plans for the employment locations, and that obviously informs the quantum of development that we've allocated on this site, because that took on board a number of constraints in these locations. So that will build upon that. Now, obviously, depending on the modifications to the policy through an SPD or a more detailed master plan, it will be a requirement, and those master plans will need to show the linkages and the integration with the new settlements to the west and the east, and the existing town, and has also been sort of considered as part of the wider infrastructure framework accordingly, and certain mitigations identified and costed to enable that to be delivered as part of the strategic growth in a sustainable manner.
And what will those sort of master plans and SPDs require of the sort of the wider existing industrial estate there at Paddock Wood? Obviously, you know, there's existing employers, existing uses. What's required there? Is there some sort of collaboration with those existing uses, or just talk to me about how that's going to sort of work then? Who's going to be producing this work, and is it going to need the input then from all these other third parties that are within that northern area?
So we're, as you know, we're looking at modifying the policy, and those are matters which are going to be dealt with more explicitly than they have been so far. In policy SS1, and they're matters to which I'm alive and others around this table are alive. Essentially, there will be a requirement for each of the parcels, including the residential allocations, to take into account the provisions of an overall master plan to be prepared as an SPD by the council. It won't set out policy requirements, but there will be, it's envisaged there will be a requirement on the part of those developers in each of the parcel to submit an overall master plan for each parcel, which will pay regard to the overall integration of development for the allocation as a whole, and to provide an implementation plan to show how services and supporting infrastructure will be delivered in a timely way. That's the phasing and implementation plan requirement as part of the master plan. And it's a device which has been used on other major settlement proposals elsewhere, and will work here. So far as the employment element is concerned, and the northern parcel is concerned, clearly the undeveloped parts, i.e. the two major allocations, will be subject to master planning requirements and to take into account the provisions of the SPD in bringing those master plans forward. One cannot, of course, that will entail, of course, taking into account existing development within the northern parcel and connectivity with the town centre and the residential parcels coming forward. And the master plan SPD will provide the framework within which those individual master plans can come forward. The existing uses there could, of course, become subject to redevelopment proposals in due course, and those closest to Paddock Wood Town Centre might, of course, involve redevelopment for mixed uses, which would be appropriate in that location. And it's envisaged that the modifications which will be proposed to the policy will make it a requirement on redevelopment proposals, again to have regard to the SPD, the master plan SPD, and also specific provisions within the policy which bear directly upon any redevelopment proposals, which relate, for example, to connectivity, legibility, with existing and prospective development taking place around it, so as to provide a workable development management context in which to consider any proposals that come forward for redevelopment in the existing developed areas. So that's how we see the policy coming forward with appropriate modifications to give effect to that.
Mr. Buckwell, thank you.
Thank you. So just to confirm from our point of view, the employment sites must be allowed to come forward separately from the housing. Certainly the Swatlands farm site site is at quite an advanced stage. A planning application has been recently submitted on that site, which has been worked up in accordance with the extensive master planning work that the council has already done. So that very much takes account of providing clear links towards and into other sites that form part of the wider master plan. But I think the key point is, there is this need for some employment development to come forward sooner rather than later. There are companies looking to relocate in Paddock Wood right now and looking to expand. So that mustn't be held up whilst waiting for future housing to come forward.
And will that plan application, the Swartlands Farm one, does that presumably, does that cover the whole of that? I'll call it the western half. I know it's not a half, but the sort of western side of the railway line, does that cover the whole part of that site then, or is it just a proportion of it?
It covers the area between Maidstone Road and that's south of Lux Lane. It doesn't include the area north of Lux Lane, which is being brought forward by somebody else.
And again, just there where you've got, maybe we talked about, identifying it as an allocation, but within that you've got two different sort of landowners and promoters promoting different schemes then. So again, how would the council control that, or does it simply not matter? The site would be allocated for B1, B2, B8. Said it again, B1, B1, B2, B8, and provided that, applications come forward and accord with these sort of higher level requirements for integration, et cetera, then it doesn't really matter that they come forward as two separate entities.
I don't think it really matters, because it will be guided by the overall master plan. I say guided by the overall master plan, and the individual master plans which will be produced will be scrutinised to make sure that proper integration occurs. And the phasing and implementation plan will also make sure they come forward in a way which is appropriate, having regard to the provision of necessary infrastructure to support them. So I don't think it really matters terribly much. Certainly it wouldn't be appropriate to be too prescriptive at this stage. And so far as its linkages with the surrounding residential development is concerned, again, we recognise fully the synergies which exist and the additional benefits which will accrue, but we don't think it's necessary to link the development of housing, which will surely come about in accordance with the policy, to the provision of employment space.
But in terms of the employment allocations at Paddock Wood, then we'll call them two allocations of sort of east and west of the railway line. How did they come about then, and what alternatives were considered? So again, it's a sort of same question on site areas then. So in terms of these actual allocations, how did they come about, and what alternatives did the council consider for the provision of employment at Paddock Wood?
So these came about through the Core for Sites exercise, and sites were submitted through and assessed then through our Sheila and alongside through the sustainability appraisal, and were through that viewed in the context, obviously, of the strategic growth that was being proposed. So when the sustainability appraisal looked at the sort of strategic growth options, obviously employment, land is an integral part of that, and the various growth strategies assessed. And I think if you look at table 12 on page 48 of the essay, and each sort of strategy, each sort of the strategic sites was assessed sort of both against employment and business objectives. The essay, through the process, obviously drew on the evidence base, which looked at the economics needs assessment, and as we've referred to in our hearing statements, it was noted through our economic needs assessment that the key employment area at Paddock Wood had potential for expansion. I think the paragraphs sort of 9.47 to of the economics needs study, which makes Paddock Woods a good employment site with good access to existing road network. Paragraph 10.27, it's that this location, it would really help to provide the job opportunities alongside the housing provision. You know, it's sort of logical when you're planning for growth of this scale to also, in line with the requirements of the NPPF when planning for strategic settlements, to provide the employment floor space alongside. Other sites for employment uses have been assessed through the SA and the Sheila, with the reasonable alternatives considered through the SA. And that includes surrounding Tunbridge Wells Hospital, Pembury, Santa's Yard, Gills Green Farm. So they're more on the smaller sites, but for the strategic sites, it was considered as part of the various growth options, if you like. So it's considered in the round for the strategic sites, as referred to sort of in previous sessions. But it was been a continual consideration as part of the sort of package of uses for that proposal.
Okay, any comments on what we've heard so far in terms of sort of mix of uses, sort of consideration of the strategy for them for Paddock Wood? Obviously, we've heard justification as to why these sites here, and we touched upon that on previous days around, you know, yes, council recognises that, you know, that it's allocating over and above sort of the need figure, but we've heard the reasons for that. So any comments then on Paddock Wood sites at this stage? No. Anything further from yourself, Mr. Buckwell? Do you want to add at this stage?
No, I don't think so in terms of detail. So I think the only point I would make, and I wasn't at the previous employment needs session, but just to stress again, you know, as a planning consultant working in this area and working with a lot of businesses often looking to expand, you know, it is just so important to have a good range of employment sites. So often I've had businesses come to me who aren't able to, you know, they want to expand their business. They look at the options available to them, and it may be one or two allocations that just don't suit their particular needs. So strongly support the council's strategy here in providing a really good choice of sites in the same way that happens for housing sites. So certainly applaud the council for doing that.
In terms of the parcel to the east of the railway line, then there was I'm just trying to go back to the master plan. There's a very small parcel at the south eastern corner of that. I think was coloured a slightly different colour. Is that intended to be employment uses, or was that intended to be something else?
So
I think it was.
It lies adjacent to the existing wastewater treatment works in Paddock Wood, so it's been safeguarded for the potential expansion of the likely potential expansion of the wastewater treatment works, and it's safeguarded for that use. Should over the plan period it be determined that that's not required, subject to consideration of other development management policies, the council would look to consider employment uses, but the primary purpose of that parcel of land is to be protected at this stage for that potential, very likely potential requirement.
And again, is that set out anywhere within the plan? That's sort of within, so it's within the employment allocation, but it's actually sort of safeguarded for that potential use.
I would have to check that actually, but we can check that and look to ensure that's clear if it's not.
Yeah, it's the effectiveness point again, isn't it? It's just making clear that both the developers and local communities know then that the intention of that site is, it is for the expansion of the wastewater treatment works if required.
Yeah, understood.
In terms of access as well, then would there be to the south of that site? Would there be any sort of pedestrian permeability then through, because you've got the eastern parcel to the south of that employment allocation? So is there intended to be any sort of permeability between those two sites, or would it very much be no, that's a sort of employment area and that would be where those uses are contained?
No, the permeability is very much at the core of this. If you note, there's a sort of little red circle with a white kind of flower symbol, if you like, which is over the railway bridge. And if you look at the strategic infrastructure framework, you will note that an item of infrastructure which is to be provided through the strategic sites is improvements to this railway bridge for pedestrian and cycle access, and that's been fully costed and expected to be funded through the development of Paddock Wood. So that will provide it's an existing crossing, but it will be very much improved to be more attractive for users from south of the railway line to north of the railway line. And then, as you can see through the structure plan, there's then proposed linkages, and we're working with KCC's public right-of-way team to link into existing public rights-of-way and through the LC WIP measures. So we have given full consideration to that, and that improved. The key barrier is the railway line, and that will be significantly improved through the growth around Paddock Wood.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay,
So I don't know if it's worth me adding that the high-level master planning also shows how the employment uses will be linked to each other and to the existing employment uses. So we haven't considered them in isolation at all. On the structure plan, the white dashed lines with arrows show a whole network which links the employment uses to the railway station, to the town centre, and to the existing and proposed new settlements.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Herbert.
Thank you very much. Good to hear about integration between sites mentioned earlier. I think just a point of clarity, whilst the Town Council is incredibly supportive, improved links across the railway line, it is important to know that it's not just that link, it's the wider network that needs to work as a whole to make walking and cycling collections an attractive proposition, so that we do get that mode shift from car-based travel to provide opportunities for walking and cycling on a day-to-day basis. For our understanding of the link to the south of the bridge, existing bridge over the railway line, is that there's an alleyway that runs along the back of existing properties, around the back of sort of fences of back gardens. We're not clear whether there's going to be proposed improvement or changes to the route, to a diversion of that, because as it is at the moment, it's not a particularly compelling route for people to use. And although there might be an improved bridge, it's actually getting to that point that's also important. So there's a wider network issue that I think needs considering here.
Mr. Bookwell, and then we'll go back to the council to respond on those points.
Yes, just going to make the quick points that in the hearing statement for the land east of Transfesa, our figure 3.1 in there is an extract from the council's master plan that shows the links that we've just been talking about, and yeah, make it clear how close that site is to the town centre and railway station, using the links that have just been discussed, but also to the Church Farm residential area to the south as well, where links are being put through as part of the planning application that's already been approved there. So just to confirm that all joins up.
Anything further from the council?
Just to very quickly say, in response to Mr. Herbert's comments, I think as we've demonstrated through the previous sessions, we've got a very comprehensive proposal for active travel through our LC WIP and the master planning, but also to refer specifically to the points of that alleyway and the southern part and getting to the bridge. As the inspector will note, planning permission on Church Farm has already been granted for 300 units, and that includes proposals for a footpath to connect into that. And land to the east of Paddock Wood that's going to be delivered by Redrow and Persimmon has a specific policy requirement for the hop pickers line to be brought into active travel use, and that will all connect into the wider network over that railway bridge. So through the strategic sites team, we're very much thinking of all these applications and planning holistically for this, so it's considered as one.
Okay, they were the only questions I had on the Paddock Wood employment allocations, unless anybody else wants to make any final representations at this stage before we move on. No. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we'll move on. I want to look at HA7 next, which is the Hawker Station Business Park. So similar question, really. I think question 1 was around, is it sufficient to developers, decision makers, the amount and type of development proposed here? And I think we've already covered that through some of the, it's the same issue. It's the same issue of clarity and effectiveness, making it clear exactly what's allocated there. In terms of this site, then it's slightly different to what we see at obviously Royal Tunbridge Wells and at Paddock Wood. So, what was the rationale for allocating a site here then in this location? Obviously, more rural context, different context to Paddock Wood and Royal Tunbridge Wells. So, what was the justification for this location of new employment land here?
Yes, sir. I think we draw your attention firstly. Obviously, we deal with this in response to the relevant questions that you ask. And I think that the first thing to highlight is the economic needs study. Looked across the borough and indeed made specific recommendations in respect of this location as serving the employment needs of the eastern part of the borough. Indeed, it is the only allocation in this part of the borough, and it was really based from an economic point of view on the success of the existing Hawker Station business park. That is essentially sort of well used, fully occupied, pressure for expansion, and indeed a fairly recent permission for a smaller unit has to the south of it. So this was an area that we looked at closely. It was looked at through the, particularly because it is an AONB location, quite sensitive. You'll see from the landscape and visual impact assessment that was specifically looked at, and the conclusion was drawn that subject to some sort of landscape buffers to the west and to the south, then it could be developed without undue harm to the character of the AONB. Say it was a promoted site as well by the landowners who operate the existing, as I say, successful business park, and therefore was felt to be subject to those other safeguards and appropriate allocation, and a sort of a proportionate extension to the existing industrial area.
So am I right in thinking that this was originally proposed as a larger site that extended further to the south, or was it another site to the south that extended further north?
There was a separate site submission to the south, as you say, for which was considered for mixed residential and employment uses, which would have essentially joined the sort of small hamlet of Gills, residential hamlet of Gills Green to the south, to the to the business area. And in looking at that, mainly in sustainability terms and overall impact of the scale of change on the character of the AONB, that was regarded as too substantial, and indeed would have represented major development, whereas this smaller extension on its own, as I say, was more contained within the landscape and related well, and could be served by the existing business park.
Is this one a key employment area? I think it is, isn't it?
Yes, it is, sir.
And does the key employment area here encompass the allocation the same way as Paddock Wood and Tunbridge Wells does? Let me just look at that.
Yes, sir, it does. with the exception of the landscape buffer and open space areas.
Okay, so the HA7 allocation then would become part of the key employment area.
That's absolutely right. So yes.
And again, in terms of sort of existing sort of field boundaries, etc., does the landscape buffer, is the extent of development, is that following anything that's, you know, recognisable on the ground, or what's the reason for the actual line that's being drawn?
Yeah, I think I would, as I say, direct you to the LVIA, because we follow the recommendations from that quite specifically, and indeed that CD 3.96 Part F, and pages 29 to 34 deal with this, and indeed it shows that includes quite a useful photograph taken from the public footpath to the west, higher up the rising ground than one of the representatives' photographs is, which clearly shows the existing industrial buildings as being visible from the public footpath to the west as you approach in otherwise I'd say very attractive AONB landscape. And we were very keen to ensure that the new development was adequately screened. There is an existing line of trees along Slipmill Road, which is a sort of itself a very, if you go out there, you'll see a very sort of a rural lane. We need to sort of clearly reinforce that, particularly on the sort of the northwestern edge. And similarly to the south, where it is more open, there's a single line of sort of not closely grouped trees along that boundary, and need to sort of reinforce that boundary, so there's a very clear containment of the industrial area from the sort of the rural setting of the hamlet of Gills Green on the southern edge.
As part of this allocation, then also you talked about how it's different to the likes of Tunbridge Wells and Paddock Wood. So how did you take into account its accessibility then? So potential future occupiers, people who are going to be working at this site. How did you take that into account, and how did you sort of weigh that up and balance that up then in the consideration of whether you should allocate additional land here?
That was addressed both through the sustainability appraisal and through the Sheila, and indeed, the site does score somewhat negatively in terms of some sustainability indicators, because it is removed from Hawkhurst, and therefore there's related sort of negative scores, but obviously it also, and to a degree in terms of the AONB as well, but overall the provision of employment within this part of the borough, and in a location which is actually directly served by public transport, as you'll see from our statement. And I think one of the Kemba Loudon Williams, on behalf of the landowner, makes similar points. There is a bus service between Hawkhurst and Maidstone through Colebrook, running past the site on an hourly basis, and there is a public footpath from the site all the way back down into Hawkhurst, albeit some distance. So there are some sort of mitigations there, but I think we accepted it's a relatively distant, but also mindful of it is an existing site, and one of the few employment proposals that came to us through the Sheila.
And in terms of the main access, then would that be taken just through the existing sort of main entrance for the the business part then, will it?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And I think that's set out in the policy wording.
Okay. So it was in addition to this site, and which an area of land that lies outside of the key employment area is site HA8, and that's March's Field, isn't it? So that's an area of safeguarded land. So again, what's the justification for safeguarding that for future employment use then?
I think we have to be careful when we use safeguarding, don't we, in this context. It's not safeguarded in the sense of a greenbelt site that it's not proposed for development in the planned period. It may well come forward in the planned period, but it is regarded as a somewhat more sensitive site. It also has a number of issues that would need to be addressed, not least in terms of access, which are provided, which would need to be considered. But it is a deliverable site in the sense it is in the same ownership, and if there were a further need, which we're not anticipating at the moment, I should have said that the existing allocation that we're making proposes a fairly significant expansion of the existing about 57% increase in the developable area over and above the existing estate. If in the event that was taken up, and I say there is ongoing interest in the extension, then if there were further need, then we would give consideration to the land to the north. Although, as I say, it is somewhat less removed. It couldn't readily be served by the same access. So there are things to consider on that, and we set out in the policy that it would be essentially, and we elaborate on through the hearing statement, that it would we would keep this under review as part of our sort of annual monitoring of employment land provision.
So if you look at policy HA8, then so it says the site is reserved for employment uses to be released for development if monitoring indicates that other employment allocations have not come forwards, or there is evidence that further employment provision is required in the eastern part of the borough, potentially at the 5-year review. It's the same question as sort of Colebrook House situation then, is either, why is the council either not just A, allocated it for employment, or B, not allocated it and said, well, there's no justification for it at the moment. So yeah, it's something we might consider next time round, but at the moment there's no justification for it, and just not had a policy.
As I say, sir, I think it is different from greenbelt situations where it is where there is a clear expectation of it not being developed within the planned period. Employment land provision is difficult. It relies largely on sort of a limited supply of sites. In this location, we are fortunate in a sense of having a local site which is providing significant employment for the eastern part of the borough, and therefore, whilst there are a number of sort of reservations with this site, we felt a case can be made for it to be developed. So it is an allocation, albeit essentially a reserve site. I think it's somewhat different from being safeguarded. Perhaps a reserve site is a better expression.
So as the sort of owner of this site, or somebody who wants to sort of build employment units here, then it says it's released for development if monitoring indicates that other employment allocations have not come forward. What do you mean by that? So obviously we talked about Royal Tunbridge Wells and we talked about Paddock Wood, but the council's rationale for those, well, the council's rationale for this site is, well, this is very different. It's different to the Royal Tunbridge Wells. It's different to the Paddock Wood. Paddock Wood sites are serving a particular, the Paddock Wood sites are serving a particular sort of role and function as part of this sort of mixed-use wider development. The Royal Tunbridge Wells site is a sort of completely different development in a completely different context. So why then is the release of this site dependent upon what those other allocations do?
I think it's obviously the council's got to be mindful of the overall employment land provision, but as the sort of the policy goes on to emphasise that further provision is required in the eastern part of the borough, and I think that is the focus. If for any reason the allocation to the south is frustrated, HA7 is frustrated in any way, or indeed more likely is actually taken up more quickly. Whilst we've made that provision for other employment allocations coming forward, that's part of the suite of considerations, but because we would have to have regard to the overall land supply. It's a factor, but I don't, as you were sort of implying, I don't think if there's a delay at one of the Paddock Wood sites that would trigger the release of this, but it is just part of the overall consideration. The main prospect is if there's evidence of further employment land is required in the eastern part of the borough.
So what would that entail? Who would do that? Because presumably the developer would come forward and they'd have a sort of, a letter from a local agent saying, yes, there's people looking for new business units in this area. Here's our plan application. Would that suffice? Is that what the council are looking for? Or would the council be looking for a new employment land review or a new economic needs assessment? What would be needed to actually allow development to come forward on this site?
Yeah, I think this was your question 17, and in essence, the council, as I sort of just touched on earlier, would review employment land take up, demand and supply through its annual monitoring process, and make and take a view as a result of that. I would have thought most likely through a sort of consideration of the implications of that monitoring through the council's own processes.
And in terms of the access to this site, then how would that be achieved? Obviously, you've got is it Limes Grove? I think the sort of road's called there. It's pretty narrow. Don't think there's any footpath particularly down there. So how do you consider the sort of suitability? You've got potential B8 uses there, storage and distribution, HGVs, etc. How is this site justified in terms of its access arrangements there?
Yeah. I think that's one of the sort of the considerations that would have to be given. As I say, there is land within the same ownership adjoining the Limes Grove, which is the name of the lane, obviously on the south side, and the frontage as well here, where it does get narrower. It's wider at the eastern end. But yes, I tend to agree that would be one of the things that would need to be looked at and could be a constraining factor in terms of the scale of and nature of buildings that went on the site. But that would have to be looked at, I think, at the planning application stage, having regard to the relevant development management policies.
Is the policy effective then as an allocation for EU's classes B2 and B8? Obviously, the existing, Hawkers business parts of the south doesn't have any access onto Limes Grove. It is a narrow, lane. Is that going to be appropriate for, let's say B8 uses storage and distribution, manufacturing under B2, with, you know, goods being delivered, products being delivered, members of staff coming and going. Is that an appropriate location?
Yeah. Yeah, I must admit, in terms of B2, it's that given the residential properties to the east, that may, I would have thought, be a limiting factor. It would really depend on the, if you like, the degree, the amenity impacts of the, and the nature of the B2 uses. But again, that would be subject to consideration at the planning application stage, having regard to the relevance of amenity policies. Bear in mind, the scale of the site is not as large as the one to the south, and much less than the existing area. So I think, you know, the actual scale, while the policy allows for B8 uses, I wouldn't anticipate those are going to be of such a scale to generate huge vehicle numbers. But again, that's something that would, you know, the council would need to look at, and hence I think it's part of the reason why the policy has been framed in the way it has.
It sounds as if the council's not quite sure about the allocation of this site, so it sort of is put it in as a maybe almost. We've got some reservations over it, we've got some concerns over it, so we'll have it in as this sort of reserve site. But there seems to be some sort of quite sort of big question marks over it, especially in terms of, like I say, proximity to residential dwellings, its size, and thus what it can actually accommodate. And the accessibility issues of Limes Grove. Any comments on this site then? I think Ms. Borland, I think at one stage you mentioned it. Any comments, representations on this site from anybody? No. Any comments generally then on the sort of employment sites at Hawkhurst, for either the sort of Marches Field, as it's called, or the other employment sites? Nope. Okay, I think with this one, it's one for me to obviously go and have a look at, and go and look at on site, and then consider further. Really, so we're talking about things like proximity of residential properties, access ways, etc. So it's one that I'll have to sort of go and look at and consider.
So could I just, my understanding, I thought the Campbell, Loud and Williams were here. I can't, representing the landowners. I didn't know if they wanted to say anything on these. I know they don't, I think, have any representations on HA8, but on HA7. Yeah, is it Mr. Holmes?
It is, sir. Sorry, I've been trying to get your attention. I'm not entirely sure whether you've seen that, but
no, I didn't see a hand up. Sorry.
Apologies. I've only got a clap and a thumbs up, so I've been trying my best to utilise those.
Go on. Yeah.
Yeah. Afternoon. Yeah. So Mike Holmes from Campbell, Loud and Williams on behalf of Kent Woodware Limited, who are a lot of the landowners. So just a couple of points from me, if I may, and just picking up on, and this is in relation to the business park, HA7, and just the success of the current park, which is fully occupied, has been for some time, and the owners also have had, over that time, and continue to have significant interest from both existing tenants and interested tenants for expansion and availability of units. So it is a well-used park, a well tenanted park, and one that I think would benefit from expansion. The other point I wanted to make, and hopefully it comes across in our submission, is the extent of the buffer, which we fully support. Integration of the site into the landscape and buffering the site but particularly the extent of the buffer to the northwestern corner and the southern edge of the site we feel is too limiting and restrictive. I know elsewhere within the draft plan, the sort of allocations are marked as indicative, but there's no reference here of any sort of indicative layout. So it could be construed as being the kind of the green area is not to be built upon, whereas we feel that if it's possible to justify extending that, then it's something that should be considered.
Okay, yeah, I think we've talked about this for insofar as the inset or the maps are concerned. I think the council can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding would be that all these maps would be indicative, and we talked yesterday, didn't we, about the residential sites in particular, that yes, when a plan application comes forward, there may be some some minor alterations here and there. And actually the maps are intended to sort of guide development proposals, but they're not, clearly defined insofar as, that they are the exact boundaries, and that would be for the, in each individual plan application to determine. And I think here where, and again, once we talked about other allocations within the AONB requiring development requirements for, consideration of landscape impacts within the AONB, and that would be clearly a requirement for HA7. Landscape impacts, especially for commercial uses, you're going to have things like obviously external lighting, car parking, loading bays, etc., etc. So all those things would need to be considered and their effects upon the landscape.
That's correct, sir, and we would make that change to this policy as well to make sure that it's clear that the boundary is flexible, and that the reference to the AONB is inserted.
Mr. Holmes, did you want to say anything about HA8? Is that your client's land as well? Is that what's envisaged there?
It historically has been used for storage and accessed by HGV. So there is scope for larger vehicles to access it. Yeah, clearly we supportive of the allocation, but appreciate that it is slightly more constrained in terms of neighbouring properties and providing appropriate adjoining uses compared to the HA7 site. Yeah, another alternative could be an extension of car parking for the business park site. That is something that that pressures have kind of increased over the years. Yeah, we're as I say, supportive of the allocation, and as we see it, access is possible, and but obviously, as been discussed, would need to be demonstrated through the submission of an application as well.
Okay, anything further from the council then on either HA7 or HA8, or from anybody else for that matter?
I don't think so, sir. I think the points have been made. You do need to see it. Mr. Scull has indicated quite rightly that they are in indicative areas. I do think that they're well justified through the LVIA, and you'll see that in the references I gave. As far as HA8 goes, just to be clear, the past, it has been used in the past in connection with a wood yard. That use ceased, and you'll see when you visit the site is sort of largely regenerated, but it does have that historic use. That's true. So, and I hear what is said in relation to sort of a parking use. I think that again would come down to scale and degree. We'd have to look at, have to consider that. Although if it was to serve the employment area, it could be, you know, within the scope of the allocation.
Just one final point for me actually on HA7 is the development requirement for the design and layout is to be informed by a comprehensive energy and climate change strategy. Couple of questions there. Is it clear what's required, and is a similar policy requirement needed for, does this occur in other employment allocations?
Thank you for mentioning that, sir. Sorry, it was on my own note. I should have raised, and it was one of two things I should have raised. This is, to be honest, a hangover from previous drafts. We haven't applied it generally. We look to cut down the number of criteria and instead make reference to other policies in the plan. And you'll see in relation to these sites that we do make reference to EN3, policy EN3, climate change mitigation adaptation. So we would actually propose that those criteria for consistency, it's not diminishing the significance of it, but for consistency with other policies and just the clarity that is struck out. And so the other point I just want to make, I realise as well that we variously refer to this site as Gills Green Business Park and Hawkhurst Station. It is the address is Hawkhurst Station Business Park. That's what we refer to in the policy, and I think we'd look to amend the references through the document to say Hawkhurst Station Business Park, Gills Green, just for clarity. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with both those points. Okay, we've got one issue to go through, which is the retention of existing employment sites and buildings. But I'll just propose we'll take a quick comfort break, if that's okay. So we'll take a 5-minute break. So we've just got one issue left. So I think we'll still get through this in time for a lunch break. But I'll propose we just take a quick break, just a 5-minute break, and we'll adjourn and resume back at 12:40, please. Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll resume and continue. One more issue to go through before lunch break, and that's in relation to issue 3, which is the retention of existing employment sites and buildings. So for this one, we go to policy ED2 in the local plan. And the first question that I asked there was, what does policy ED2 relate to? Does it apply to all sites and buildings, or only the allocated sites? And council, you've said yes, it refers to all sites and buildings. So the first question there is does the policy need tweaking then, just to make that clear?
Good afternoon. My name is Gwenda Bradley. I'm Senior Planning Officer in the Planning Policy team at Tunbridge Wells. Yes, as we've set out in our response to question 1, whether ED2 applies to all employment sites, we've made that clear in our response that it does. And I would agree with the inspector that maybe we could clarify that further in the supporting text to the policy, just so it's clear.
So is it the case then that policy ED2 relates to, yes, it talks about existing land and buildings, doesn't it? Employment sites and buildings. I think if it relates to all buildings, you could just consider the, insertion of the word all, and then that just makes it abundantly clear that it does refer to all buildings.
Yeah.
There's no,
It's as simple as that, really.
And then, all existing employment sites and buildings. The way in which policy ED2 works there, so it states there that, or may state that all existing employment sites and buildings will be retaining their existing use or an alternative employment generating use to support the vibrant and balanced economy of the borough, take into account whether they, and then there's four points there. And then there's a separate part of the policy, and it's a separate part of the policy that says, okay, if you're an applicant and you want to see redevelopment, so maybe redevelopment for housing, and then you go through parts A to D. So just taking it in turn then, what do parts 1 to 4 of the policy require somebody to do? So what's 1 to 4 seeking to achieve? So again, let's go with the typical scenario. You've got an existing employment use within Royal Tunbridge Wells, and the developer wants to, it's no longer fit for purpose, and the developer wants to redevelop it for housing. What do? Do they go straight to parts A to D, or where does points 1 to 4 come into the consideration?
I think you would need to look at everything really as part of the assessment. Maybe A to D first, in assessing whether the site is still viable, and whether you can mark it as still being a viable option within employment use. But I think we would look at them all, and they'd all be, in terms of the type of information we'd expect to be submitted or how they would be considered, it will be done in a different way. So location, under point 1, that it will be for the council to determine, where is it located? Is it accessible to a main road and public transport networks? And then in terms of point 2, could the existing property be improved? Is it viable of being improved, redeveloped, so it does provide a better standard of accommodation? So the applicant would need to have a look at that in the first instance and put some information in, and that would really sort of tie in with some of the criteria under the A to D, particularly criterion B, where you've got to provide evidence that there's no prospect of the existing buildings or partial comprehensive redevelopment of these buildings being continued for
their current use. And you also would need to consider whether you could have a different type of employment in there, whether it could accommodate a range of other employment uses.
So just dealing with 1 to 4 then. So it says taking into account whether they are well located to a main road and public transport networks. So in my sort of worked example, if my site wasn't well located to a main road and public transport network, what then? Does that mean that site then doesn't need to go through the marketing and trying to find alternative uses?
I think my colleague's going to answer that question, Mrs. Evans.
Yeah, I think we'd need to consider those things in the round. So if there was a site that was clearly not very well related, in a remote location, sometimes there'd be a sort of historic employment use in an area that's not particularly sustainable, then we'd need to consider that. And if it wasn't considered to be very well related, then we wouldn't necessarily ask them to then provide criteria A to D, because they've already demonstrated to us in at that first stage that it's not very well located. It's if it's a very old building and it can't be it can't be redeveloped to provide modern accommodation, then we wouldn't necessarily then ask them to satisfy like the second part of the policy. But if there was a site that it was well located, and we think there's a possibility that it could be redeveloped or reconfigured to make it attractive to the market, then we would ask them to actually demonstrate that they have considered these other elements of the policy A to D.
Yeah, I think maybe have a look at that, and if that's the case, then it just needs to be clearer that that's what the council's intending to do. Because I agree, if you've got a site that it may be a historic sort of non-conforming use, and it's sort of come to the end of its sort of lifespan, and the developer says, look, this it's a non-conforming use, really it's not an appropriate consideration for continued employment. Why then would you require somebody to market it for 18 months when everyone accepts it's just not the right site for employment? So I think yes, that's what a policy like this should do. And it just needs to be clearer then that's the council's intention. So I think it probably just needs to have a bit of thought to the wording in the way in which the wording is set out.
Yeah, no, noted. We can have a look at that to make it more explicit of how those criteria would be applied.
Any comments on that change there from any participants who paid representations on this one? Yeah, we'll go to Alex Jones.
Hi, Alex Jones from Stantec on behalf of Logistics UK. Logistics UK, they're established business in the borough. They're an owner-occupier of Hermes House, which is on St John's Road in a residential area. And I would say that probably falls into the category that the inspector has just been discussing in terms of sort of a non-conformist historic type use. So I'm quite encouraged by the discussion and the refinement of the policy. I think what we'd suggested in our hearing statement was that perhaps the policy would benefit from a two-stage approach, whereby you have sort of the points 1 to 4 as an initial sifting of the sites, whether they then should be caught by the subsequent more detailed and onerous provisions of A to D. So I think that, that would be helpful. I think it would clarify how the policy is intended to operate, and help your development management colleagues as well in applying the policy to worked examples, which would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the general thrust of that, and I don't think it's a million miles away from where the council's sort of intentions are with this policy. It's that, yeah, it's just that site that just isn't suitable, as continuation of an employment use. So why would you then require this sort of 18-month marketing when potentially you would just get other similar uses when there'd be far greater benefit in actually seeking its redevelopment for an alternative mix of uses. Now, how you word that again probably needs some sort of careful consideration, because it might be that you do get the odd site where yes, it would be inappropriate to sort of have a continuation of an employment use, but there may be scope for sort of especially on large sites, for sort of a mix of uses or different types of employment uses. So I don't think it should sort of necessarily de facto mean you don't need to provide any further consideration. It can just go sort of straight to residential. It is quite a careful balance, but I do agree with the representative that it could just be set out in a slightly different way. Probably not going as far as what the representative suggests, but nonetheless making it clear that if you've got these sites where it's just no sort of realistic prospect, or it would be unsuitable for continued employment use, for residential amenity, access, highways, etc., then the policy should be flexible enough to allow its redevelopment without sort of this extended period of marketing. Because what the marketing is trying to do is say, if you've got a good employment site, yes, one operator may have left that site, but it's still contributing to your overall land supply, and you want to test thoroughly that it's no longer needed.
The last 2 points of the policy, actually, at the bottom of policy ED2, 1, 2, and 3 do refer to sort of redevelopment of employment buildings and sites for mixed use may be permitted where such development, and it does list some criteria there where that type of approach would be supported. So again, we could look to see how the wording, if we need to just do some tweaking of the policy to bring that further up in the policy to allow for that as well.
Yeah, and I think the policy needs to recognise, and I also can help you with some of the wording on this, is recognising those really sort of unsuitable for continued employment uses, that clearly you wouldn't be requiring those to sort of continue through the marketing. And I appreciate that would be a judgment, and ultimately that would be a judgment for the council as a decision maker, and there may well be no doubt some disagreements down the line, but I think it would nonetheless be worthwhile to consider that within the policy, that it's not just that every single site is required to provide 18 months of marketing, if clearly there were just some that would be unsuitable for continued employment use. Why frustrate those from coming forward for housing, especially maybe within a built-up urban area? Obviously talked on previous days about the constraints that you face in terms of AONB and Greenbelt and finding housing sites.
That's understood. Thank you very much.
So where we do move on then, so we've got past that sort of first part of the policy, and we've moved on to the situation where council said, well, no, it is necessary to consider an alternative use then. I think the employment needs study suggested a sort of 2-year marketing, was that right? And then the local plan has got an 18-month sort of requirement, and these are typical policies that we see, within lots of local plans across the country. So, various different councils go for different lengths of time. Why 18 months? Do you think that's justified? Do you think it's about right?
Well, I'll set out in our response to question 3. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of echo on my microphone. Sorry about that. Yeah, as set out in the council's response to question 3, which asks about what is the justification for requiring 18 months of marketing. We do set out at paragraph 11 on page 8. You're right, we did have a 2-year marketing period recommended in our economic needs study, but given that the current economic climate has changed somewhat, especially given COVID-19, And as a result of comments received to our Regulation 19 draft local plan consultation, and also the recent retail, commercial, leisure and town centre uses study update, which the council undertook in 2020. This recommends a marketing period of 18 months for retail units. And we thought that this would be an appropriate timescale to apply to other employment uses. So as a result of those three things, and in discussion with our economic development unit here at the council, we thought a reduced period of 18 months would be more appropriate. And we go on to say in our response that we think that's a sufficient period of time to allow enough time for applicants to fulfil other requirements of the policy. So that includes efforts to promote, improve and market the facility for sale or rent at a reasonable value, which reflects the existing use and condition of the building, and to demonstrate that this has been undertaken. I think if you have too short a period, you won't be able to fulfill the other requirements of the policy. Thank you.
As part of this policy as well, so it's not just a sort of standard 18 months, there's also Part D to this policy then, where it has been demonstrated through an independent assessment that the current use is no longer viable. There is no reasonable prospects of continued use or take-up of other employment generating uses. Proposals for redevelopment must consider alternative uses in the following order. So I was slightly confused by that because it says other business uses, all other non-residential employment generating uses. What's the council require an applicant to do then? Because if you've marketed the building for 18 months and there's been no suitable offers made, that's demonstrated then that there's sort of no demand for this building. And how then do you demonstrate these other points? Because obviously you're talking about residential employment generating uses within C1 and C2, and all other non-residential employment generating uses, which presumably could be absolutely anything. So how would an applicant do that? Because presumably they've only marketed the building for its permitted uses. Or are you expecting an applicant to go through this 18 months of marketing? Should they market it for sort of everything? What are you requiring an applicant to do?
Yeah, I think what we'd be asking the applicant to do would be to market it. We'd expect them to market it for 18 months for business use, and then if that wasn't, if there wasn't interest and it wasn't going to come forward for business use, then we as a council we'd have to consider other uses for the site. I don't think we wouldn't be asking them to market it for all these other uses. I think we'd ask them to market it for business use, and then we could consider other uses. And our preference would be that a site could come forward for another employment generating use. But if that wasn't likely, then obviously then we'd need to sort of think about, if it's no longer going to be sort of achieving any sort of employment type use, then residential would be that sort of last resort, I guess.
Yeah, I think the problem with this is that you require an applicant to demonstrate that the site's no longer viable and no reasonable prospect through its 18-month marketing. The policy then sort of has this, you must consider alternative uses, which could be absolutely anything. So it's not clear as to what the applicant's considering. And then it talks about uses such as C1 and C2. So again, as the sort of owner of the factory building that's no longer required, how do I consider whether it's suitable for C1 or C2 uses? Do I have to go and sort of then market it again and test the market for extra care developments, for example? It just sounds quite onerous. And again, who's considering it, and what happens if the council was to turn around and say, well, we think it would make a great extra care site? What would the applicant need to do then?
Yeah, so I think I understand fully the point. I think the problem is with the drafting of D, where it talks about no reasonable prospect of continued use or take up of other employment generating uses. So at that point, that would have been established by the evidence, let's assume. You're then being asked to consider in order whether other business uses could be carried out on the site, whereas the work which has been undertaken shows that it can't be. So we're asking them to prove something all over again. And then all other non-residential employment generating uses would also have come within that remit, one assumes. So 1 and 2 is asking, in effect, for the applicant to do the job twice when it's already been done. So that's the first thing that needs to be cured. The other thing is what it goes on then to require is to look at in order residential employment generating uses and then the other mixes and then wholly residential schemes. It's probably the case that there's no need to make an order, as it were, or a priority of 3 over 4, as they're both employment generating uses. So it could be either or. And then as a last resort, a wholly residential scheme. So it seems to me that the policy could be reworded to make it more effective, to obviate any sense that the policy is asking you to conduct the same exercise all over again when it's already been established by the first exercise that other business uses and non-residential employment generating uses will not be likely, and then to require 3 and 4 to be considered equally. And then if that cannot work, it's not viable, or there's no prospect of any such employment generating use coming forward, then to consider as a last resort wholly residential schemes. And of course, all of these would have to be, as it were, considered against all other relevant policies in the plan to make sure that, for example, a residential scheme would be appropriate on that particular site.
Because your part A requires the marketing of the building for existing use or other potentially suitable employment generating uses. So you've done it.
You've actually done all that.
You've
already.
done it. Yeah. You've demonstrated. And this would be a situation where you had an example where you had a site and yes, it'd been marketed. There was no offers for the existing use, but actually there's quite a lot of interest for another employment use. That's when the council would be sort of saying, presumably, well, no, we're not convinced this can go straight to residential because actually there's lots of interest for other employment uses. So it's covered by A anyway.
Indeed, it is. Yeah. So I think it just needs further clarification and working through. One understands what it's trying to achieve, and that's absolutely fine. It's laudable and legitimate planning aim. It's just the way in which the policy has been structured, I think, which leads to confusion. So that could be sorted. Yeah,
it's just for effectiveness. And it may even be that D is deleted, it's not needed, but have a look at it. And I think you obviously know the problem and needing to rectify it.
Thank you very much.
There was a hand went up, but it quickly went down.
Sorry, that was me. It was just I was just going to say, obviously the way it's drafted at the minute, the policy assumes that residential is not an appropriate use for the site, and it was just to say that obviously there are going to be some employment sites and buildings that are in solely residential areas, that the appropriate use may well be residential. Obviously, the inspector has just suggested that perhaps D won't be necessary because you will have arrived at that point earlier in the process. And I had one further point just on the marketing and an 18-month period for the marketing. It was just to query whether marketing is the only suitable form of evidence to demonstrate that a site is no longer suitable or viable. You know, Logistics UK have a site. They're owner occupiers of that site. They've had, they could well market it for 18 months, but their business would stagnate during that time. And they've had local agent advice, very detailed advice, that the market for another owner occupier to take that building in that location is virtually nil. They wouldn't be able to let it. Obviously, they're not a landlord, so it's not their business anyway. But it's got such a poor EPC rating that from 2027, it would be illegal to let it in any event. So it was just to say whether there's an opportunity for an alternative form of advice rather than just, or evidence rather than just marketing.
I think that would come under the first part of the policy, as I said, that the first part of the policy where it sort of infers about relation to main roads, and I've sort of said to the council, actually, it's the suitability of sites, isn't it? So it's that first. Obviously, I'm not going to pass comment on on individual sites, but I think to sort of take a step back and consider this sort of strategically is that yes, the council. I don't think wants to go down the sort of route of requiring sort of a wholly unsuitable site to be marketed for 18 months for sort of almost no purpose. And I think the council accepts that.
Yeah, I think
it's the wording.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay.
I think the second part of the policy should be prefaced with the words that where the above criteria are met, then you go on to consider the criteria which follows if people want then to change the use. So if it doesn't meet all of those criteria, then of course you don't have to go down the list.
Yeah.
It'll be decided in accordance with other policies in the plan.
Yeah, agreed. So there were some suggested changes already, I think, to ED2, but I think we've probably sort of superseded and covered those through the discussion that we've just had. What I did want to ask about, and I thought the question, it was going back actually to question 4, where you've got the key employment areas, does this policy ED2 apply? And would the same policy requirements apply? And if the answer to that question is yes, do you think that's appropriate for your key employment sites?
No, I think our response to question 4 deals with that issue. I think obviously within the key employment areas, policy ED1 applies within those areas. And we've obviously talked about some changes that we'd make to policy ED1 this morning to make that more effective. And then I think the policy ED2 will apply for those sites that aren't covered within ED1.
So sorry then, so obviously at the start of this conversation, I thought ED2 applied to all sites.
All existing sites, sorry, yeah, sorry.
Maybe what ED2 could do. So ED2 is your sort of go-to policy for that change of use away from employment. Perhaps what ED2 needs to do, and the reason for the question was, it's treating an existing employment site, so site A within Royal Tunbridge Wells or Paddock Wood, whatever. It's treating it in the same way as your key existing employment areas or a site on a key existing employment area. And what the council's evidence has said is that the key the key employment areas are our sort of, main areas, sort of flagship key sites. So whether or not you think the policy in ED2 should have some sort of requirement that almost sort of adds an additional layer on top. So where you've got a site, say for example, you've got a change of use of an employment site in a key employment area, yes, it's going to require the marketing in the same way, but whether or not there should also be an additional requirement that says something like, and shall not undermine the role and function of the key employment area. It's that, it's that recognition that that site is in a key employment area. We've designated it for that use, so it almost has a further additional consideration that's necessary. And that's not to say, thou shalt not never have a change of use, but it's to say you also need to consider its impact on the role and function, because you may get a large, you may get a really large site within a key employment area. It comes up, it's marketed for 18 months, but actually to allow that to go to an alternative, say residential use or some other use, would really undermine your key employment area, which is something that you obviously the evidence is saying that that you should seek to prevent. So so it's just whether or not you should have that extra requirement in there potentially.
Yeah, I think we can actually. We can separate out the key employment areas to cater for those very exceptional circumstances, although I wouldn't use that expression in the policy. And that's on the premise, of course, that the key employment areas have already been assessed for the suitability of those uses and their viability as part of the evidence base for the plan. So we could have something separate within ED2, which relates only to key employment areas, and to put in that caveat so that there is afforded an extra layer of protection with respect to the allocations and the strategy of the plan.
Yeah, and it would just be an additional requirement. Yeah, again, just not going to undermine their role and function or whatever wording fits really.
Okay, that's understood.
And that was that. So any other representations, questions anybody would like to make then on everything we've heard so far this morning? Any other points anybody wants to make?
Not from us, thank you, sir.
No. Mr. Herbert?
Thank you, sir. This might not be the right time and place to ask, but the Town Council has got tomorrow held in its diary for the reserve day. I don't know if the Town Council has heard whether that's still needed or not.
No. As we stand now, 1:15, no. Obviously, there's the rest of this afternoon, but no, it's there's nothing planned for the reserve day, particularly tomorrow. Obviously, see how we go on this afternoon. I'm pretty confident we will get through this afternoon, but no, there's nothing thus far, unless Charlotte tells me otherwise. Then no, there's no reserve session tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all. So those attending this afternoon, it's a separate session, so we'll adjourn for lunch break and then we resume back at 2 p.m. But leave this session and then it's a separate sign on for this afternoon session. Okay, thank you.